Staff Sergeant Elena Vance was staring at the rhythmic flicker of a faulty LED on her signal processor. A 3-beat stutter that reminded her of her father's old heartbeat before the surgery in Dayton. When Major Thorne placed his palm flat on her desk and told her to keep her mouth shut for the remainder of the deployment. The air inside the Tactical Operations Center, a modified expandable van buried in the rain-drenched hemlocks of the Olympic Peninsula, smelled of ozone, burnt coffee, and the damp, heavy wool of 16 soldiers who hadn't showered in 4 days. It was 0314 hours. Outside, the Pacific Northwest was a wall of black timber and freezing mist, but inside, the world was reduced to the neon green glow of spectrographs and the low, pressurized hum of the /MLQ-40 Prophet system. Thorne didn't wait for her to acknowledge the order. He was a man who viewed silence as a form of obedience, and Elena had been giving him a lot of it lately. He moved toward the map table, his Gore-Tex jacket rustling with a sound like dry leaves, leaving Elena to stare at the screen where a ghost was dancing. Elena Vance did not look like a woman who carried a secret that could dismantle a career. She was 32, with the lean, corded muscle of a distance runner and eyes the color of a winter lake in her native Ohio. She had grown up in a house where silence wasn't a void, but a language. Her father had been a master horologist, a man who fixed the kind of clocks that required a magnifying loupe and the patience of a saint. In his workshop, Elena had learned that everything in the universe had a frequency. If you listened long enough, the gears told you when they were tired. If you watched the pendulum, you could see the friction before it became a problem. She had carried that sensitivity into the Army, through the grueling technical schools at Fort Huachuca, and into 3 deployments where her ability to hear the hiss between the pops had saved more than a few patrols. But here, in a joint force exercise that was supposed to be a scripted demonstration of American electronic warfare dominance, her gift was becoming a liability. She reached out and adjusted the gain on her headset, her fingers moving with the muscle memory of a concert pianist. The sensation of the dials was the only thing that felt real. The plastic was cold, slightly textured. Underneath the official exercise traffic, the simulated red team chatter, and the mundane logistics of 300 Rangers moving through the brush, there was something else. It wasn't a voice. It wasn't even a signal in the traditional sense. It was a ripple in the noise floor, a periodic attenuation of the background static that shouldn't have been there. It was a shadow moving underwater. "Vance," a voice whispered. She didn't turn her head. She knew it was Specialist Miller. Miller was 22, from a suburb outside of Phoenix, and he was the only person in the unit who had realized that Elena wasn't just staring at the screen. She was reading it like a novel. He was sitting at the adjacent terminal, his face washed in the blue light of a frequency-hopping log. He had seen her mark the anomaly 3 times in the last hour. He had also seen Major Thorne delete the marks each time he walked by. "He's on a warpath," Miller said, his voice barely audible over the cooling fans. "The colonel is coming in at 0600 for the final brief. Thorne wants the board green. He doesn't want unidentified atmospheric interference clogging up the sitrep." Elena shifted her weight in the high-backed tactical chair. The lumbar support was broken, a small, nagging physical irritation that she used to keep herself grounded. "It's not atmospheric, Miller," she said. Her voice was low, controlled, stripped of any inflection that might be mistaken for emotion. "Lightning doesn't have a cadence. This does. It's a 4-2-second pulse width. It's masking a low probability of intercept burst. Someone is piggybacking on our own relay." Miller looked at his own screen, then back at hers. "I don't see it. Look at the noise floor at 432 megahertz, she instructed, her voice softening. "Don't look for the peak, look for the dip. Look at how the static flattens out every 4 seconds. It's not an addition of sound, it's a subtraction." Miller squinted, leaning in until his nose almost touched the glass. After a long minute, he sat back, his throat working as he swallowed. "Jesus, Elena, if that's a burst, it's coming from inside the perimeter." "I know," she said. She felt the heat of Thorne's presence before she heard him. The major had returned from the map table, his shadows stretching long and distorted against the corrugated metal walls of the TOC. He stood behind her, his breath smelling of the peppermint gum he chewed to stay awake. He was an officer who believed in the primacy of the plan. To Thorne, the exercise was a machine, and he was the operator. Variables that didn't fit the manual were to be discarded. "Staff Sergeant," Thorne said, his voice a controlled rasp. "I thought I made myself clear." Elena didn't blink. She kept her eyes on the waterfall display, watching the green cascades of data pour down the screen. "Sir, the anomaly is persisting. It has moved from the secondary relay to the primary command net. I've cross-referenced it with the red team's signal plan. It doesn't match their equipment's signature." Thorne leaned down, his face inches from hers. To anyone else, it would have looked like a consultation. To Elena, it was a cage. "We are in the middle of a Tier 1 validation exercise, Vance. The National Security Council has eyes on this. If we report a breach in the primary command net that turns out to be a hardware glitch or a localized multipath interference from the trees, I'm the one who has to explain why we halted a $50 million operation for a hunch. Do you understand? It's not a hunch, sir. It's data." "It's noise," Thorne countered, his voice dropping an octave. "And you are being a distraction. You've been on shift for 16 hours. You're seeing ghosts because you're tired. Now, you will sit there, you will monitor the exercise traffic as scripted, and you will keep your mouth shut until the radio goes dead at the end of the final phase. That is a direct order. If I see you flag that frequency one more time, I'll have you relieved for cause before the sun comes up." He straightened, his hand lingering on the back of her chair for a second too long, a gesture of dominance disguised as a pat on the back, and then he walked away. Elena felt the rage, but she didn't let it reach her hands. Her hands remained perfectly still on the keyboard. It was a quiet, cold rage, the kind that had fueled her through the nights in Ohio when she was a girl, meticulously cleaning the dust out of a 19th-century carriage clock while her mother shouted at her father in the kitchen. She had learned then that being right didn't matter if you couldn't prove it, and you couldn't prove it if you were screaming. She closed her eyes for a heartbeat. In the darkness of her mind, she could still see the signal. It wasn't just a line on a graph. To her, it had a texture. It felt like the jagged edge of a broken fingernail. It was a violation of the clean, mathematical beauty of the spectrum. She opened her eyes and saw Miller watching her. He looked frightened. He was a good kid, a technician who followed the rules because the rules were safe. He saw the danger in Thorne's eyes, but he didn't see the danger in the signal. Elena realized then that she was entirely alone in the room. Not because people weren't there, but because she was the only one who had the language to describe the disaster that was currently unfolding in the air around them. She reached into the pocket of her OCP trousers and pulled out a small silver coin, a challenge coin her father had given her when she graduated from basic training. It had a clock face on one side and the signal corps crossed flags on the other. She rolled it over her knuckles, a rhythmic, silent movement. The metal was warm from her skin. "Elena," Miller whispered. "What are you doing?" "I'm listening," she said. The next 2 hours were a masterclass in professional endurance. The TOC buzzed with the frantic, artificial energy of the exercise's climax. Radio operators were shouting coordinates. The Blue Force was executing a simulated pincer movement on a ridge 5 miles to the north, and the colonel arrived, bringing with him a retinue of officers who smelled of rain and importance. Thorne was in his element, briefing the colonel with a laser pointer and a confident smirk. He pointed at the screens, the green boards, and spoke about the resilience of the network and the superiority of their signal masking. Elena sat in her chair, a ghost in the machine. She did exactly what she was told. She monitored the exercise traffic. She logged the scripted messages. But in a small, minimized window in the corner of her secondary monitor, she was running a script she had written herself 3 months ago during a boring rotation at Fort Gordon. It was a heuristic filter designed to isolate non-random patterns in white noise. The filter was screaming. The 4-2-second pulse had changed. It was no longer a subtraction. It was expanding. It was beginning to bleed into the surrounding frequencies. a subtle, creeping rot that was slowly degrading the integrity of every encrypted channel in the AO. It was like watching a virus spread through a bloodstream in real time, but because it was happening at the subcarrier level, the automated diagnostic tools were ignoring it. They saw the signal strength was high, so they reported the channel as healthy. They didn't realize the signal they were measuring was no longer their own. She looked at the clock. 0542. The air in the van felt thinner. The humidity had peaked, and a heavy, sodden silence had settled over the woods outside, the kind of silence that precedes a catastrophic change in weather. Elena could feel the static electricity building in the room, the way the hair on her arms stood up. It wasn't just the equipment. It was the atmosphere. Then the first failure happened. It was small. A lieutenant on the ridge reported a scratchy feed. Thorne brushed it off as terrain masking. Then a captain in the valley reported a synchronization error on his SATCOM link. Thorne told him to switch to the backup. Elena watched her screen. The 2-second pulse had stopped. In its place was a flat, terrifying line of absolute zero. "Major," Elena said. She didn't raise her voice, but the tone of it, sharp, cold, and final, cut through the chatter of the room like a blade. Thorne didn't even look back from the map table. "I told you to be quiet, Vance." "Major," she repeated, and this time the colonel turned. Colonel Hendricks was a man with a face like a topographical map of the Badlands, and he had been around long enough to know when an NCO was using their serious voice. "What is it, Sergeant?" Hendricks asked. "The radio is about to go dead, sir," Elena said, her eyes locked on Thorne. Thorne let out a short, bark-like laugh. "We're in the middle of the final assault, Colonel. The sergeant is just experiencing some technical fatigue." "Vance, get back to your—" The sound cut out. It wasn't a fade. It wasn't a hiss. It was as if someone had reached out and deleted the concept of sound from the universe. Every radio in the TOC, every speaker, every headset went silent. The hum of the cooling fans suddenly felt deafening in the absence of the electronic chatter. The green lights on the racks didn't turn red. They didn't flicker. They just stayed green, mocking the room with the illusion of connectivity. "What happened?" Hendricks demanded, stepping toward the comms rack. "Thorne, why is the net down?" Thorne was stabbing at his tablet, his face turning a mottled, angry red. I don't know, sir. It must be a local power surge. Miller, check the breakers." "Breakers are fine, sir," Miller shouted, his voice cracking. "The hardware is showing active. There's nothing coming in." "Vance," the colonel said, turning to her. "You saw this coming. Explain." Elena stood up. She didn't look at Thorne, whose jaw was set in a hard, trembling line of fury. She looked at the colonel. She felt the weight of the moment, the specific, crushing pressure of being the only person who knew how to bridge the gap. She felt a strange, detached sense of peace. This was the clockwork. This was the friction she had seen coming. "It's not a blackout, sir," she said. She reached out and grabbed the main console's master override key, a heavy brass piece she kept on a lanyard. She slotted it into the manual port. "It's a wide-spectrum inversion. Someone has been mapping our encryption keys for the last 4 hours using a low-frequency pulse. They waited until the entire net was synchronized, and then they flipped the phase. We're not hearing anything because our radios are now interpreting our own signals as noise, and the noise as the signal." "Who?" Hendricks asked. "Not the red team," Elena said. Her fingers began to fly across the keyboard, not with the frantic energy of Thorne, but with the precise, rhythmic grace of her father's workshop. "The red team doesn't have the processing power to execute a phase inversion on a 256-bit rolling key. This is state level, and they're not just jamming us." She hit a final sequence of keys, and the waterfall display on her screen transformed. The flat line vanished, replaced by a complex, shimmering lattice of violet and deep blue data. "They're using the silence to talk over us," she said. She reached for a pair of old-school, high-impedance headphones, the kind the Army had stopped issuing 10 years ago, but which she had kept in her personal kit because they didn't rely on digital processing. She slid them over her ears. The silence in the room was absolute as the officers watched her. Thorne looked like he wanted to physically pull her away from the desk, but the colonel's hand was on his arm, a silent command to stay back. Elena closed her eyes. She tuned out the room. She tuned out the smell of the damp wool and the ozone. She focused entirely on the sound in the headphones. It was a high-pitched, rhythmic whistling like a bird trapped in a tin can. To anyone else, it would have been gibberish. To Elena, it was a pattern. She began to type. Asterisk Sector 7. 0400. Objective, Sierra 1. Asterisk the words appeared on the big screen in the center of the TOC, stark white against a black background. What is that? Hendricks whispered. The enemy signal, sir, Elena said, her eyes still closed, her fingers moving in a blur. I'm decoding the burst. It's an extraction order, but it's not for the exercise. They're using our training coordinates as a grid for a real-world movement. Vance, that's impossible, Thorne hissed. This is a closed range. Elena ignored him. Her world was now the whistling in her ears. She heard the shift in the frequency, the way the bird changed its song. It was a secondary channel, a different voice. This one was lower, grittier. Asterisk package is secure, moving to extraction point Echo 4. Asterisk Echo 4? Hendricks said, his voice sharpening. That's the old logging airstrip on the north side of the ridge. That's outside the exercise boundary. They're using the exercise as a screen, sir, Elena said. She opened her eyes. They were bright, focused, and terrifyingly cold. They've been inside our net since we arrived. They knew exactly when the blackout would hit. They're moving something out of the country, and they're using our own communications blackout to make sure no one sees them leave. Can you track them? Hendricks asked. Elena looked at the screen. The violet lattice was beginning to break apart. The enemy knew she was there. They could feel her probe. I have a lock on the transmitter's origin, but I can't hold it for long. They're rotating the carrier every 12 seconds. Thorne, Hendricks barked. Get the quick reaction force on the line, now. Sir, the radios are still dead, Thorne said, his voice shaking. We have no way to reach them. The runners will take 20 minutes to get to the QRF pad. Elena didn't look up. She was already ahead of them. I can't use the radios, sir, but I can use the signal they're using. She grabbed a patch cable from the rack and began to bridge the output of her processor back into the main transmitter. Vance, what are you doing? Thorne yelled. You'll fry the entire rack. That's unauthorized. Major, Elena said, and for the first time she looked him directly in the eyes. Keep your mouth shut. The silence that followed was different than the radio blackout. It was the silence of a hierarchy dissolving in the face of absolute competence. Thorne stepped back, his face pale. Elena turned back to the screen. She didn't have much time. The bird was singing faster now, a frantic, jagged rhythm. She captured the waveform, inverted it, and slammed it back into the atmosphere. It was the electronic equivalent of a flashbang. On her screen, the violet lattice shattered. And then, the sound came back. But it wasn't the exercise chatter. It was a raw, unfiltered burst of audio from a ground-to-air frequency that shouldn't have existed. Contact, we have a breach. The net is compromised. Abort extraction, abort. The audio cut out as the transmitter on the other end was killed. But it was too late. The location was burned into the system. Elena sat back. Her hands were trembling now, just a little. The cost of the focus was beginning to register in her joints, in the dull ache behind her eyes. She looked at the screen. The coordinates for Echo 4 were pulsing in red. Colonel Hendricks didn't waste a second. He was already on the command radio, which had hissed back to life the moment Elena broke the inversion. All units, this is Eagle 6, real-world scenario. Shift to secondary comms plan. Objective, extraction point Echo 4. Intercept and detain. Use of force is authorized. The TOC erupted into a different kind of chaos, the real kind. The officers were no longer playing a game. They were moving with the grim, focused intensity of men who had just realized they were at war. Thorne stood at the edge of the activity, a man whose world had been reduced to a footnote. He looked at Elena, and for a moment, she saw the sheer, unadulterated hatred in his eyes. She had been right. She had been right in front of the colonel. She had broken his order, broken his machine, and saved his career, and he would never forgive her for any of it. Elena didn't care. She reached for her ceramic mug. The coffee inside was stone cold and tasted like wet dirt, but she took a sip anyway. She felt the weight of the challenged coin in her pocket. Miller was staring at her, his mouth slightly open. "How did you do that?" he whispered. "The phase inversion. How did you even know the math for that?" Elena looked at the flickering LED on the processor, the one that still stuttered in a 3-beat rhythm. "My father always said that if you want to know how a clock works, you don't look at the hands," she said, her voice quiet and steady. "You look at the friction. The friction tells the truth." Outside, the first hint of gray light was beginning to filter through the hemlocks. The rain had turned into a light, insistent drizzle. In the distance, the muffled thud-thud-thud of black hawks rising from the valley floor began to vibrate through the ground. Elena watched the spectrograph. The violet lattice was gone. The spectrum was clean again, but she knew it was a temporary piece. She knew that somewhere, in another dark room across an ocean, someone was already adjusting their frequency, looking for the next gap, the next friction. She turned back to her terminal and began to type the after-action report. She started with the time, 0314. She described the signal. She described the 4 2-second pulse. She didn't mention Thorn. She didn't mention the rage. She just wrote the data. But as she worked, she could feel the colonel watching her from the map table. He wasn't looking at the coordinates anymore. He was looking at her the way a man looks at a weapon he didn't know he had in his arsenal. Elena Vance kept her head down. She didn't need his validation. She didn't need a medal. She just needed the silence to stay honest. She reached the end of the first page of her report and paused. She could feel a new sensation, not a signal but a premonition. The exercise was over, but the story was just beginning. The package at Echo 4, the state-level encryption, the breach in their own perimeter, it all pointed to something much larger than a single extraction. It pointed to a rot that went deeper than the Olympic Peninsula. She looked at Miller. "Miller," she said. "Yeah, Elena. Keep a log of every frequency shift in the last 24 hours. Don't use the automated system. Do it by hand." Miller nodded, his expression solemn. "You think they're still out there?" Elena looked at the black screen, her own reflection staring back at her, a woman who had spent her life listening to the things no one else wanted to hear. "They're always out there, Miller," she said. "The noise never stops. You just have to decide which part of it is a lie." She went back to her typing. The hum of the van was steady now, a comforting, mechanical heartbeat. But beneath it, Elena was already searching for the next ripple, the next shadow in the static. She was a signal intelligence specialist, and she had just found the frequency of a conspiracy that reached far beyond the rain-soaked trees of Washington state. The report would say she followed protocol. The report would say the system worked. But Elena knew the truth. The system had failed, and the only thing that had stood between a clean escape and a successful intercept was the daughter of a clockmaker who knew how to listen to the friction. And she wasn't finished listening. As the sun finally broke over the ridge, casting long, pale shadows across the forest floor, Elena Vance realized that the radio hadn't just gone dead. It had been a warning, and the messages she had decoded were only the first few notes of a much longer, much more dangerous song. She hit the save key and waited for the next burst. She didn't have to wait long. At exactly 0612, a new signal appeared on the noise floor. It was faint, almost imperceptible. It was a 4 2-second pulse. Elena's fingers froze over the keyboard. Her heart, usually so steady, gave a single, hard thump against her ribs. The signal wasn't coming from the ridge. It wasn't coming from Echo 4. It was coming from a handheld transmitter inside the TOC. She didn't move. She didn't look around. She just sat there, the cold coffee in her hand, the headphones still around her neck, and realized that the enemy hadn't just been in the net. The enemy was still in the room. The realization was a cold spike of adrenaline. She could feel the presence of the 17 other people in the van, the breathing, the rustle of paper, the tap of keys. One of them was a traitor. One of them had just sent a signal, a status check or a confirmation, right under the nose of the colonel and the staff sergeant who had supposedly just saved the day. She didn't look up. She knew that if she looked up, she would give it away. She had to be the clock. She had to be the gear. She slowly reached out and adjusted the filter on her screen, masking the new pulse so that even Miller wouldn't see it. She buried it under a layer of simulated echo from the primary transmitter. Then she began to record. She would find out who it was, not through a confrontation, not through an accusation. She would find them the way she found everything else. She would find them through the friction they created. Elena Vance leaned back in her broken chair, her eyes fixed on the flickering LED, and waited for the next tick of the clock. The silence was gone. The war had just moved inside. She felt the weight of the moment, the cost of what she now knew. She could tell the colonel, but who could she trust? Thorne, Miller, the courier who had brought her the orders. She was alone. But she was the most dangerous person in the room because she was the only one who knew the song. She closed her eyes and listened. Behind her, she heard the sound of someone shifting their weight, the sound of a Gore-Tex jacket rustling, the sound of a sharp, shallow intake of breath. Elena didn't turn, she just waited. The cliffhanger was a physical thing now, a cord stretched to the breaking point. The threat was no longer a violet lattice on a screen, it was a heartbeat in the dark. And Staff Sergeant Elena Vance was the only one who could hear it. She felt a strange, dark competence wash over her. This was what she was made for. This was why she had survived Ohio, why she had survived the desert, why she had survived the dismissal of men like Thorne. She was the listener. And the most important thing she had ever heard was the sound of the person standing 3 feet behind her, waiting for her to make a mistake. She didn't make mistakes. She reached for her pen and wrote a single line on the margin of her notepad, a line that no one else would understand, a line that was a map to a betrayal she was only beginning to uncover. Asterisk, the pendulum is swinging back. Asterisk, she capped the pen with a soft, decisive click. Outside, the Black Hawks were landing, their rotors whipping the mist into a frenzy. Inside the van, the light was gray and cold. Elena Vance stared into the black glass of her monitor and prepared to decode the rest of the lie. The rustle of the Gore-Tex was a dry, abrasive sound, like a serrated blade drawing across heavy canvas. Elena didn't turn her head. She didn't even let her breathing change, though her lungs felt as if they were filled with the same freezing mist that was currently suffocating the hemlocks outside the van. In the dark reflection of the monitor's black bezel, she saw a shape move behind her, a silhouette against the amber glow of the secondary workstations. It was a broad-shouldered figure, the kind of mass that belonged to someone who spent their downtime in a gym rather than a library. The silhouette paused, hovering just at the edge of her peripheral vision. Elena's hand remained on her cold coffee mug, her fingers curled around the ceramic with a grip so steady it felt like part of the table. She wasn't watching the reflection anymore. She was listening to the heartbeat of the TOC. It was a symphony of small failures. The cooling fan's whine, the click of a mouse, the distant, rhythmic thud of the Black Hawks over the ridge, and now, the soft, rhythmic tapping of a finger against a trouser leg. 3 taps, a pause, 3 taps. It was the same cadence as the pulse on her screen. The presence behind her shifted again, the floorboards of the expandable van groaning under the weight. Then, Major Thorne's voice broke the silence, but it wasn't directed at her. "Colonel, the QRF is reporting positive contact at Echo 4. They've got 2 vehicles pinned in the clearing. No markings, high-end comm suites." Colonel Hendricks moved toward the map table, his boots heavy and decisive. "Tell them to secure the site and hold for the marshals. I want every piece of hardware in those trucks bagged and tagged." Vance was right. This isn't a training exercise anymore. Elena felt the shift in the room's atmosphere. The tension didn't dissipate, it transformed. It went from the frantic energy of a crisis to the predatory focus of a hunt. But while the officers were hunting a ghost in the woods, Elena was still hunting the ghost in the room. She kept her eyes on the waterfall display, which she had successfully masked. To anyone else, the screen showed a chaotic mess of post-blackout interference, a dirty spectrum typical of a system recovering from a wideband inversion. But beneath the digital camouflage she had layered over the feed, the 4-2-second pulse was still there. It was stronger now. It wasn't a broadcast, it was a handshake. Someone inside the TOC was communicating with a receiver that was very, very close. "Staff Sergeant," the colonel said, his voice closer now. Elena looked up, finally letting go of the mug. Hendricks was standing 5 feet away, his face etched with a grim kind of respect. "Good work. I'll be sure the CG hears about your performance today. Thorne, get her a relief. She's been on the glass too long." "Already on it, sir," Thorne said. He was standing near the exit of the van, his hand on the door handle. He didn't look at Elena. He looked like a man who had just seen his life's work narrowly avoided a disaster, or perhaps like a man who was already calculating how to reclaim the narrative. Miller, take over Vance's station. Feed everything she's logged into the main sitrep. Miller stood up, looking small and overwhelmed in the wake of the morning's events. He caught Elena's eye as she stood, his gaze flickering with a million questions he knew better than to ask. Elena stepped out of the chair, her legs stiff, her lower back screaming from the broken lumbar support. She moved with a deliberate, slow grace, the movement of a woman who was acutely aware of every person's position in the cramped space. As she passed Miller, she didn't speak. She didn't have to. She reached out and tapped the corner of his monitor, a sharp, quick double-click with her fingernail. It was a gesture they had developed during a grueling 3-week field problem in the Mojave a year prior. It meant, *watch my back and don't trust the automated logs. Miller's eyes widened a fraction of a millimeter, a tiny tell that only she would recognize. He sat down and began to type, his movements jerky and nervous. Elena grabbed her assault pack from the floor and headed for the door. As she stepped out of the TOC, the cold air of the Olympic Peninsula hit her like a physical blow. The rain had slowed to a fine, stinging needle spray that smelled of pine needles and jet fuel. The sky was a bruised purple, the light of the coming dawn struggling to penetrate the thick canopy of trees. She took a deep breath, letting the freezing moisture coat her lungs. It felt honest. It felt real. She didn't head for the mess tent or the sleeping quarters. She walked toward the edge of the perimeter, where a row of Humvees and LMTVs sat idling in the mud, their exhaust plumes rising like ghosts in the dim light. She needed space. She needed to think. But more than that, she needed to see who followed her. She stopped at the edge of a small ravine, 20 yards from the nearest sentry. She pulled out her phone, a ruggedized, encrypted device issued by the Signal Corps, and looked at the signal strength. It was full, the network was back. But as she watched the bars, she saw them flicker, a 3-beat stutter. "You should be sleeping, Staff Sergeant." The voice came from behind a parked LMTV. Elena didn't flinch. She knew the cadence of that voice. It was Master Sergeant Sela's Ward. Ward was the unit's senior NCO, a man who had spent 24 years in the Army and looked like he had been carved out of a piece of old oak. He was the kind of man who didn't say much, but when he did, the words had the weight of a court-martial. He was also the only person Elena truly respected in the chain of command. He didn't play the politics of Thorne, and he didn't have the grandiosity of Hendricks. He was just a soldier. "I can't sleep with a ringing in my ears, Master Sergeant," Elena said, not turning around. Ward stepped into the light, his ox dark with rain. He was carrying 2 cardboard cups of coffee. He walked up beside her and handed her one. The heat from the cup seeped through her gloves, a small, grounding mercy. "The Colonel thinks you saved the day," Ward said, looking out over the ravine. "Thorne thinks you undermined his authority. I think you found something you weren't supposed to find." Elena took a sip of the coffee. It was better than the sludge in the TOC, strong, bitter, and hot. "I found a signal, Master Sergeant. Signals don't have opinions, they don't have agendas, they just exist." "Maybe," Ward said, "but the people who send them do. That extraction at Echo 4, the boys in the QRF are saying those weren't just some mercenaries. They had tech we haven't even seen in the field yet. Burst transmitters the size of a Zippo. High-gain arrays that fold into a backpack. That's not red team gear, Vance. That's something else." Elena looked at him. Ward's eyes were tired, but they were sharp. He had been watching her in the TOC. He had seen the way she handled the inversion. "The 4 2-second pulse," she said quietly. "Did you hear it?" Ward nodded slowly. "I didn't hear it on the net. I heard it in the room. It was like a clock ticking in the back of my head. I've been in this business a long time, Elena. I know when a room is being played." The use of her first name was a rare breach of protocol, a signal of its own. It meant the conversation was now officially off the record. "It's still happening," Elena said. She pulled her phone out and showed him the signal bars. "There's a transmitter inside the wire. It's heart beating. Someone is letting the package know that even though the extraction failed, the back channel is still open." Ward looked at the phone, then back at the dark line of the trees. "Who was behind you in the TOC?" "I don't know," Elena admitted. "I saw a silhouette in the reflection, broad shoulders, Gore-Tex. It could have been half the unit, but they were tapping, 3 beats, a pause, 3 beats. Thorn? Ward asked. He was at the door when I left, but he's a narcissist, Master Sergeant. He wants to be the hero of his own story. A traitor has to be comfortable with being a ghost. Thorn likes the spotlight too much. Then who? Elena looked back at the TOC van, its windows glowing with that sickly green light. I don't know yet, but I know how to find them. Every transmitter has a signature. A tin in the signal, caused by the unique imperfections in the hardware's crystal oscillator. It's like a fingerprint. If I can get close enough to the source when it pulses, I can map it. Ward sighed, a long, heavy sound that seemed to carry the weight of the entire morning. You do that, and you're stepping off the map, Vance. If you're wrong, Thorn will have your stripes for breakfast. If you're right, well, people who can phase invert a 256-bit key don't usually go quietly into the night. I'm already off the map, Elena said. She looked at her challenge coin, rolling it over her knuckles. The moment I broke Thorn's order, I stopped being a staff sergeant and started being a witness. I might as well finish the job. Ward watched her for a long moment, his face unreadable. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, ruggedized thumb drive. He pressed it into her hand. This is the raw log from the secondary relay. Thorn ordered it deleted, said it was cluttered with artifacts. I saved a copy before he could wipe the server. Elena felt a surge of something that wasn't quite hope, but was close enough. Why are you giving this to me? Because I'm too old to be a hero, and I'm too tired to be a liar, Ward said. He turned and began to walk back toward the command post. And because your father used to fix my grandfather's pocket watch in Dayton. He always said you were the only one who could hear the friction. Prove him right, Elena. He disappeared into the mist before she could answer. Elena stood by the ravine for another 10 minutes, the thumb drive a small, cold weight in her palm. She felt the isolation of the moment, the specific, crystalline loneliness of a person who knows a truth that could destroy everything around her. She looked at the drive. This was the institutional failure in a physical form. Thorn, her superior officer, was actively destroying evidence of a breach because it threatened his career. The system was designed to protect the hierarchy, not the truth. And she, a mid-level NCO, was the only one standing in the way of that failure. She turned and headed back toward the motor pool. She couldn't go back to the TOC, and she couldn't use her own laptop. The unit's internal network was likely being monitored by whoever had the transmitter. She needed a clean machine. She needed a way to look at the logs without leaving a footprint. She found what she was looking for in the back of a maintenance LMTV. It was a ruggedized diagnostic terminal used for checking the engine sensors. It was clunky, slow, and had no connection to the tactical net. It was perfect. She climbed into the back of the truck, the smell of grease and cold metal surrounding her. She sat on a crate of spare parts, the dim light of the terminal's screen illuminating her face. She plugged in the thumb drive and began to dig. The data was a mess. Ward had been right, it was cluttered with artifacts, the digital shrapnel of the phase inversion. But as Elena peeled back the layers of noise, her father's voice echoed in her mind. Asterisk focus on the friction. Asterisk she looked for the places where the data didn't flow smoothly. She looked for the micro-stutters in the timestamp. There, at 0412, exactly when she had first noticed the 4.2-second pulse, there was a tiny 12-millisecond delay in the TOC's internal server response. It was too small for the automated diagnostics to flag, but to Elena, it was a gaping wound. It meant that something was tapping directly into the server's motherboard, a physical bridge. The traitor wasn't just using a handheld transmitter. They had hardwired a pirate bridge into the unit's core processor. Elena's blood went cold. This wasn't just a leak, it was a total compromise. Whoever had done this had access to everything, the encryption keys, the troop movements, the personal files of every soldier in the unit. The package at Echo 4 hadn't been the prize, it had been the bait. The real objective was the data, and it was being bled out of the TOC one heartbeat at a time. She began to cross-reference the server logs with the TOC's personnel roster. She needed to know who had been near the server rack in the last 48 hours. The list was short. Thorn, Ward, Miller, and 3 other technicians. She felt a pang of guilt as she looked at Miller's name. He was a good kid. He was loyal, but he was also young and easily manipulated. Could someone have used him? She shook the thought away. She couldn't afford sympathy. She needed data. She looked at the timing of the server delays. They were perfectly synchronized with the 4-2-second pulse. Every time the signal beat, a packet of encrypted data was being shunted through the bridge to the external transmitter. It was a slow bleed, designed to avoid detection by the bandwidth monitors. At this rate, they would have the entire exercise database by noon. Suddenly, the truck's suspension shifted. Someone was climbing into the back. Elena reacted with the instinct of a soldier. She slammed the terminal shut and reached for the Gerber multi-tool on her belt, the blade flicking out with a quiet snick asterisk. "It's just me," a voice whispered. Miller's face appeared in the gap of the truck's canvas cover. He looked pale, his eyes darting around the dark interior. He was shivering, and not just from the cold. "Elena, I found it," he said, his voice trembling. "In the TOC, I did what you said. I looked at the noise floor instead of the peak." Elena didn't lower the knife. "What did you find, Miller?" "A MAC address," he said, pulling a crumpled piece of paper from his pocket. It was buried in the subcarrier of the primary relay. "It's an unauthorized device, but it's not an external one. It's registered to a military-issue tablet." He handed her the paper. Elena looked at the string of numbers. Her heart stopped. The MAC address belonged to a tablet assigned to the unit's intelligence officer, Captain Sarah Vance. Elena stared at the name. Sarah Vance. No relation, but they had been in the same unit for 2 years. Sarah was a quiet, meticulous officer who specialized in human intelligence. She was the one who had provided the threat assessment for the exercise. She was also the only other woman in the command group. They had shared coffee, talked about their families, and bonded over the specific challenges of being a woman in a male-dominated field. "Are you sure?" Elena asked, her voice a low rasp. "I checked it twice," Miller said. "And Elena, there's more. Captain Vance isn't in her bunk. I went to find her after the colonel called for a staff meeting, but her tent was empty. Her gear is gone." Elena felt the weight of the betrayal settle in her stomach like lead. Sarah, the woman she had trusted. The woman who had sat across from her at the mess table and talked about her daughter's dance recitals in Virginia. "Where is she now?" Elena asked. "I don't know," Miller said. "But the motor pool sergeant said a Humvee left the perimeter 10 minutes ago. No mission orders. He thought it was a courier for the colonel." Elena stood up, the Gerber still in her hand. The decision was made before she even realized it. She wasn't going to the colonel. She wasn't going to Thorne. They would spend hours debating the protocol, checking the logs, and by the time they reached a conclusion, Sarah would be gone with the most sensitive data in the Pacific Command. "Miller," she said, her voice hard and cold. "Get your gear. We're going after her." "Elena, we can't," Miller stammered. "We'll be AWOL. Thorne will." "Thorne is irrelevant," Elena cut him off. "If that data leaves the peninsula, people will die. Real people, Miller. Not simulated targets. Now, are you with me or not?" Miller looked at her, his fear warring with the loyalty she had earned over a dozen bad shifts and 100-hour work weeks. He looked at the knife in her hand, then at the hard, unflinching light in her eyes. He swallowed hard and nodded. "I'm with you," he said. They moved through the motor pool like shadows. Elena knew the routine. The guards changed at 0630, and there was a 3-minute window where the northern gate was unmanned while the sentries swapped their gear. They found a scout Humvee parked near the fuel bladders. It was fully fueled and had a radio set to the unit's secondary frequency. Elena climbed into the driver's seat. She didn't use the ignition. She used the bypass she had learned in tech school for emergency recoveries. The engine roared to life, a low, throaty growl that felt like a challenge to the silent woods. "Hang on," she said. She slammed the vehicle into gear and tore out of the motor pool, the tires churning the deep mud into a brown froth. They cleared the gate just as the new sentries were walking up the road. Elena didn't look back. She kept her eyes on the narrow, winding logging road that led toward the coast. The drive was a blur of gray trees and black asphalt. The rain started again, a torrential downpour that turned the world into a smear of movement. Elena drove with a focused intensity, her hands steady on the wheel even as the Humvee fishtailed on the slick corners. She was listening, not to the radio, but to the air. "She's heading for the coast," Elena said, more to herself than to Miller. There's a private pier in Knee Bay. If she has a boat waiting, she can be in international waters in an hour. Can we catch her? Miller asked, clutching the dashboard. We have to, Elena said. They reached the crest of a ridge and the Pacific Ocean opened up before them, a vast, churning expanse of steel-gray water. In the distance, Elena could see the lights of a small town. And between them and the town, a single set of taillights was moving fast. Elena pushed the Humvee harder, the engines screaming in protest. She could feel the friction now, the physical resistance of the world against her intent. It was the same feeling she got when a gear was about to strip or a signal was about to break. It was the feeling of a clock reaching the end of its wind. The chase lasted for 20 miles. The other vehicle, a tan Humvee just like theirs, was driving with a reckless desperation. They were gaining on it, the gap closing yard by agonizing yard. Suddenly, the vehicle ahead of them swerved. It skidded across the road, hit a patch of standing water, and slammed into a thick stand of fir trees. The impact was a dull, heavy thud that echoed through the rain. Elena slammed on the brakes, the Humvee skidding to a halt 20 yards away. She was out of the door before the wheels had stopped turning, her M4 carbine raised to her shoulder. "Miller, stay back," she shouted. She approached the wrecked vehicle with a slow, tactical precision. The front end of the Humvee was crumpled, steam rising from the shattered radiator. The driver's side door was hanging open. Elena reached the door and looked inside. The airbag had deployed, a white, deflated lung draped over the steering wheel. But the seat was empty. She looked toward the trees. A trail of blood led into the brush. "Vance!" The voice came from the darkness of the woods. It wasn't a shout. It was a calm, steady call. Elena moved toward the sound, her boots sinking into the wet moss. She found Sarah Vance leaning against a massive, moss-covered cedar tree. She was clutching her side, her face pale and streaked with blood. In her other hand, she held a military-issue tablet. "Stop right there, Elena," Sarah said. She wasn't holding a weapon. She was holding the tablet like a shield. "I know you. You won't shoot an unarmed woman." Elena kept the rifle leveled at Sarah's chest. Her finger was steady on the trigger. "Give me the tablet, Sarah. It's over." Sarah laughed, a dry, hacking sound that ended in a cough. "It's never over. You of all people should know that. The signal doesn't stop just because you find the source." "Why?" Elena asked. The question felt heavy, a cost she hadn't expected to pay. "You have a family, you have a career. Why sell out for this?" "Because the institution is a lie, Elena," Sarah said, her voice growing stronger. "Do you think Thorne cares about you? Do you think Hendricks sees you as anything other than a line on a spreadsheet? They use us until we're broken, and then they discard us. I just decided to get paid for my service before they threw me away." "You're not just stealing data," Elena said. "You're putting every soldier in that unit in a crosshair. Is that what your service is worth?" Sarah looked at the tablet. The screen was glowing with a series of rapidly scrolling numbers. The 2-second pulse. "It's worth more than you'll ever know. This data, it's not just about this exercise, it's the entire architecture of the Pacific Defense Net. With this, the people I work for can blind every radar from here to Guam." "I can't let you do that," Elena said. "Then shoot me," Sarah challenged. "But if you do, the tablet has a dead man's switch. The moment my thumb leaves this sensor, the entire database is broadcast to a satellite. You can't stop it." Elena felt the tension of the moment, the specific, agonizing pressure of a situation where every choice leads to a disaster. She looked at Sarah, a woman she had called a friend, and saw the rot that had taken hold. It wasn't a grand conspiracy. It was the quiet, grinding failure of a person who had lost their way in a system that didn't know how to value them. Elena lowered the rifle slightly, not because she was giving up, but because she was listening. The rain was drumming against the leaves. The wind was whistling through the trees, and beneath it all there was a sound. A high-pitched, rhythmic whistling. The bird in the tin can. It wasn't coming from the tablet. It was coming from Sarah's jacket pocket. Elena realized then that the tablet was the distraction. The dead man's switch was a lie. Sarah was waiting for something. She was waiting for the signal to reach its climax. "The pulse isn't a heartbeat, Sarah," Elena said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "It's a countdown." Sarah's eyes widened. For the first time, the confidence flickered. "What are you talking about?" "The 4. 2-second pulse, Elena said, stepping closer. I mapped the signature. It's not a data burst, it's a trigger. Whoever you're working for, they're not interested in the data. They are interested in the TOC. Elena's mind raced through the math, the frequency, the friction, the bridge in the server, the phase inversion. It wasn't a heist. It was a demolition. The signal was designed to overload the TOC's power regulators, creating a catastrophic surge that would turn the entire van into a bomb. They're going to kill everyone, Sarah, Elena said. Thorne, Miller, Ward, everyone. The data is just the excuse to get you to plant the trigger. No, Sarah stammered. They promised. They said it was just a collection. Look at the screen, Elena commanded. Sarah looked down at the tablet. The numbers had stopped scrolling. In their place was a single, pulsing red icon, 0004, 0003. Elena didn't wait. She lunged forward, not for the tablet, but for Sarah. She tackled her to the ground just as a blinding flash of white light illuminated the horizon back toward the camp. A second later, the sound hit them. A low, gut-wrenching roar that shook the very earth beneath them. Elena lay in the mud, her ears ringing, her heart hammering against her ribs. She looked back toward the camp. A column of black smoke was rising into the gray sky, a dark, jagged scar on the landscape. The TOC was gone. She looked down at Sarah. The captain was staring at the smoke, her face a mask of horror and disbelief. The tablet lay in the mud between them, its screen dark. I didn't know, Sarah whispered. Elena stood up, her body aching, her soul feeling as if it had been stripped bare. She looked at the smoke, thinking of Miller, who was still in the motor pool. Thinking of Ward, who had given her the drive. Thinking of the 16 soldiers who had been inside that van just an hour ago. The cost was absolute. She reached down and picked up the tablet. It was heavy, a piece of cold plastic and glass that had just cost a dozen lives. She looked at Sarah, and for a moment the rage flared in her eyes, a quiet, controlled fire that wanted to consume everything in its path. But she didn't strike. She didn't scream. She simply took the tablet and turned away. Miller, she shouted into the rain. I'm here. Miller emerged from the brush, his face covered in soot but his eyes bright with a terrified relief. He had been far enough away from the blast to survive, but the shock of it was written in every line of his body. Are you okay? He asked, his voice cracking. I'm alive, Elena said. That's all that matters right now. She looked at the smoking ruin in the distance. The exercise was over. The conspiracy was real, and she was the only one left who knew how to bridge the gap. She felt a new sensation, not fear, not rage, but a dark, unwavering competence. The system had failed. The institution had crumbled. But she was still standing, and she had the data. What do we do now? Miller asked. Elena looked at the tablet, then at the road leading toward the coast. She knew what she had to do. She couldn't go back to the army. She couldn't trust anyone in the chain of command. She was a ghost now, a signal in the noise. We finished the mission, she said. She started the Humvee, the engines roar a defiant sound in the aftermath of the explosion. She didn't look at Sarah, who was still sitting in the mud, a broken woman in a broken world. As they drove toward the coast, the first rays of the sun finally broke through the clouds, casting a long, pale light across the water. Elena Vance watched the horizon, her hands steady on the wheel, her mind already decoding the next signal. The war hadn't ended with the explosion. It had only just begun, and she was the only one who knew the frequency of the enemy. She reached into her pocket and felt the challenge coin. The metal was cold now, but she held on to it, a small, grounding weight in a world that had lost its anchor. Elena, Miller said quietly. Yeah, the signal, it's still there, isn't it? Elena looked at the signal bars on her phone. They were full, and they were flickering. 3 beats, a pause, 3 beats. It's still there, Miller, she said, her voice a low, steady promise. But this time, I'm the one sending the response. She pushed the Humvee harder, the road opening up before them like a map to a future they hadn't chosen, but were now the only ones capable of navigating. The cliffhanger wasn't a cliff at all. It was a horizon. And Elena Vance was driving straight toward it, the daughter of a clockmaker who finally knew exactly how to stop the gears from turning. Behind them, the smoke continued to rise, a silent testament to the cost of being right. But in front of them, the Pacific was wide and deep, a vast, uncharted territory where the only thing that mattered was the truth. And Elena Vance was done being silent. She hit a button on the tablet, a sequence she had memorized from the raw logs. The screen flared to life, a complex map of the entire Pacific Defense Network appearing in a shimmering grid of light. "They think they won," she whispered. She looked at the map, her eyes finding a single, isolated coordinate in the middle of the ocean, a place that didn't exist on any official chart, but was pulsing with a familiar 4-2-second rhythm. "They're wrong." She slammed the Humvee into a higher gear, the engine's scream echoing off the trees. The chase was no longer about a traitor or a tablet. It was about the signal itself, and she was going to follow it to the very end of the world. Miller watched her, his expression a mix of awe and terror. He knew that the woman sitting next to him was no longer just a staff sergeant. She was something else, something more dangerous. "Where are we going?" he asked. Elena didn't look at him. She didn't have to. Her eyes were fixed on the map, on the pulsing red dot that represented the heart of the conspiracy. "We're going to the source," she said. And as the Humvee disappeared into the morning mist, the only sound left in the Olympic Peninsula was the rhythmic, relentless ticking of a clock that was finally, after so many years, running on time. The institutional failure was complete. The betrayal was total. But the listener was still listening. And she had just found the frequency that would bring the whole system down. Elena Vance smiled, a thin, hard line of a smile that never reached her eyes. The pendulum was swinging back. And this time, it was going to hit like a hammer. She reached for the radio, not to call for help, but to send a single, encrypted burst of data, a signal that would let the people at the other end know exactly who was coming for them. She didn't use a code. She didn't use a key. She used the friction. The burst went out at exactly 0714. It was a 4-2-second pulse, but inverted. A subtraction that felt like an addition, a silence that sounded like a scream. Then she turned off the radio and drove into the light. The story was no longer about survival. It was about retribution. And Elena Vance was the only one with the language to write the final chapter. She felt the weight of the moment, the cost of the path she had chosen. She had lost her unit, her career, her friend. But she had found her voice. And in the world of signals intelligence, a voice was the most powerful weapon of all. She watched the road, her hands steady, her mind clear. The noise was gone. The static had cleared. For the first time in her life, the world was perfectly, terrifyingly silent, and in that silence she could hear everything. The next pulse came 3 minutes later. It wasn't a countdown. It wasn't a heartbeat. It was a question. Elena Vance didn't answer it. She just kept driving, the girl from Ohio who knew how to fix clocks, now preparing to break the world's most dangerous machine. The horizon was close now. The water was calling, and the signal was louder than it had ever been. She closed her eyes for a heartbeat, feeling the rhythm of the road, the vibration of the engine, the specific, physical texture of the moment. Then, she opened them and stepped on the gas. The mission wasn't over. It was just beginning, and she was the only one who knew the way. The steering wheel of the Humvee vibrated with a violent, rhythmic shudder that Elena felt in the marrow of her humerus. She didn't fight the vibration. She absorbed it, her hands light but certain on the rim as the vehicle cleared the final logging road and hit the rain-slicked pavement of Highway 112. Behind them, the pillar of black smoke from the Tactical Operations Center was a jagged tear in the morning sky, a testament to the 16 lives she hadn't been able to save. She didn't let herself think about the names. Not yet. Names were heavy, and right now, she needed to be weightless. She needed to be a signal, moving at the speed of light toward the only thing that could stop the broadcast. "They're going to think it was us," Miller said. His voice was thin, brittle as scorched paper. He was staring at the side mirror, his eyes fixed on the smoke. "The logs show we left the wire right before the surge. Sarah's gone. The TOC is a crater. Elena, they're going to hunt us." "Let them hunt," Elena said. She didn't look at him. Her eyes were locked on the dashboard, specifically the ruggedized tablet she had propped against the radio mount. The red dot was moving, not on the road, but across the water. Sarah was the lure, Miller. The tablet was the trigger. But the broadcast, the actual data mining of the Pacific Net, isn't happening from a Humvee. It's happening from a fixed-point relay, somewhere with enough power to punch a hole through the atmospheric interference. "Where?" "Nibe," she said, her voice a low, steady drone that matched the engine's roar. "There's a Navy decommissioned listening post at Cape Flattery. It was supposedly mothballed in the 90s, but the infrastructure is still there. The fiber optic lines, the hardened power grid, the high-gain arrays. If you wanted to bleed the Pacific Command dry without being seen, that's where you'd sit." The rain turned into a blinding sheet of gray, hammering against the windshield with the sound of 1,000 small hammers. Elena pushed the Humvee to 65, the maximum the steering could handle on the winding coastal roads. Every time she rounded a bend, the Pacific Ocean teased her through the trees, a vast, churning slate of gray water that felt like it was waiting for her to fail. The sensory input was overwhelming, but Elena filtered it. She closed her eyes for a microsecond, listening to the Humvee. She didn't hear the engine, she heard the friction, the slight whine of the alternator, the uneven wear on the front left tire, and beneath it all the 4-2-second pulse still humming in the electronic background of the world. It was louder now. It wasn't just a signal anymore, it was a physical pressure against her eardrums. "Give me the radio," she said. "The radio's dead, Elena." "The surge fried the shortwave," Miller replied. "Not that radio, the handheld, the one you took from the motor pool." Miller reached into his vest and pulled out a small, black Motorola. Elena took it with her right hand, her left never leaving the wheel. She didn't look at the buttons. She felt them. She knew the internal circuitry of this model, the specific crystal oscillator that governed its frequency. She began to tap the side of the casing against the dashboard, a sharp, rhythmic strike. "What are you doing?" "Retuning it," she said. She wasn't using the menu, she was using the vibration. By hitting the casing at a specific resonance, she was physically jarring the oscillator into a harmonic frequency that shouldn't have existed on a standard issue radio. It was a trick her father had shown her with an old Zenith shortwave when she was 9 years old. "Everything has a frequency where it breaks," he'd told her. "And everything has a frequency where it opens." The radio hissed, a spray of white noise that sounded like the ocean outside. Then it cleared. A voice came through, distorted, cold, and professional. "Site is secure, all local assets neutralized, commencing Phase 4. Time to broadcast, 12 minutes. Miller gasped. "That's not us, that's not Army." "Private contractors," Elena said. She handed the radio back to him. "They're the cleanup crew. They didn't just kill the TOC. They're here to make sure no one survives to tell the story." She slammed the brakes. The Humvee skidded, its rear end swinging toward the cliffside before she corrected the slide and brought it to a halt in the middle of the road. She didn't wait for the vehicle to stop vibrating. She hopped out into the rain, the cold water instantly soaking through her ops. "Why are we stopping?" Miller scrambled out after her, his boots splashing in the deep puddles. Elena ignored him. She walked to the back of the Humvee and tore open the equipment locker. She pulled out a spool of copper wire, a set of signal boosters, and a laptop she had salvaged from the maintenance truck. "Elena, we don't have 12 minutes. We have to call the marshals, we have to." "There is no one to call, Miller," she said, her voice cutting through his panic like a scalpel. She looked at him then, her eyes 2 pieces of flint-gray glass. "The marshals are 3 hours away. The nearest QRF is grounded because of the blackout. We are the only 2 people on this peninsula who know what is happening. If we don't stop that broadcast, the Pacific Fleet becomes a collection of very expensive targets for anyone with a missile." She began to move with a terrifying, mechanical efficiency. She didn't look like a staff sergeant anymore. She looked like a technician at the end of the world. She ran the copper wire from the Humvee's battery to the signal boosters, then up to the whip antenna on the roof. Her fingers moved with a dexterity that shouldn't have been possible in the freezing rain, stripping wires with her teeth, twisting connections into place with the precision of a jeweler. "What are you doing?" Miller asked, his voice a whisper of awe. "I'm building a phase inverter," she said. "The listening post at the Cape is hardened. I can't hack it from the outside, but I can flood it. If I can hit their primary array with a countersignal at the exact moment they start the broadcast, I can blow their hardware from the inside out." "How do you know the frequency?" "I don't," she said, her eyes narrowing as she looked toward the dark silhouette of the Cape. "I have to feel it." She climbed back into the Humvee, the laptop open on her lap. The screen was a chaotic waterfall of data, but to Elena, it was a map. She reached out and touched the screen, her fingers tracing the patterns of the 4-2-second pulse. She could feel the friction again, the slight resistance in the data where the enemy's encryption was rubbing against the natural background noise of the ionosphere. "Miller, get in," she commanded, "and hold onto something." She didn't drive toward the Cape. She drove toward the cliffs. The road ended a mile later, replaced by a narrow, mud-slicked trail that wound along the edge of the Pacific. To their left was a wall of black rock. To their right, a 300-foot drop into the white foam of the surf. The Humvee groaned, its tires spinning in the sludge, but Elena didn't hesitate. She pushed the vehicle through the brush, the branches of the hemlocks screaming against the paint. "We're not going to make it," Miller said, his knuckles white as he gripped the grab bar. "We are," Elena said. She saw it then. The listening post. It was a low, concrete bunker perched on the very tip of the Cape, surrounded by a double layer of chain-link fence topped with concertina wire. 3 massive satellite dishes rose from the roof, their white surfaces stained with moss and salt. They were moving, turning slowly toward the west, toward the heart of the Pacific. A black SUV was parked near the gate. 4 men in tactical gear were standing outside, their rifles held at the low ready. They weren't looking for a Humvee, they were looking for a threat. Elena didn't slow down, she accelerated. "Elena!" Miller screamed. She didn't hit the gate. At the last possible second, she yanked the wheel to the right, sending the Humvee onto a narrow spit of land that overlooked the bunker. She slammed the vehicle into park and grabbed the laptop. "Output on," she shouted. The signal boosters on the roof of the Humvee hummed, a low, predatory sound that made the air feel heavy with ozone. Elena's screen turned a brilliant, blinding white as the counter-signal began to build. 10 seconds, she whispered. She could see the men by the bunker now. They had heard the Humvee. They were moving toward the fence, their rifles coming up. A red flash ignited at the muzzle of one of the weapons, and a bullet shattered the Humvee's side mirror. "Down!" Elena pushed Miller's head toward the floorboards. She didn't duck. She couldn't. She needed to see the signal. She watched the satellite dishes on the bunker. They were locked. The air around the dishes began to shimmer, the physical manifestation of the massive amounts of data being pushed through the atmosphere. "Now," Elena said. She hit the enter key. The world didn't explode. It didn't even make a sound. But for a split second, the air between the Humvee and the bunker seemed to fold. A massive, invisible wave of electromagnetic energy tore through the rain, striking the satellite dishes with the force of a physical hammer. In the bunker, the lights flickered and died. The satellite dishes didn't just stop moving, they buckled, the metal screaming as the internal motors were fused by the power surge Elena had sent back down their own lines. "Direct hit," Miller whispered, looking up from the floor. But the victory was short-lived. The black SUV was already moving. The tactical team had realized where the signal was coming from, and they were racing up the trail toward the Humvee. "Get out," Elena said. She grabbed her M4 from the rack. "Now!" They scrambled out of the Humvee just as a burst of automatic fire tore through the windshield. They dove into the thick brush of the cliffside, the wet ferns swallowing them as the black SUV skidded to a halt 10 yards away. Elena didn't run. She turned. She moved with a silent, predatory grace, her boots making no sound on the moss. She was no longer a technician. She was a soldier who had been pushed past the point of no return. She saw the first man come around the front of the SUV. He was wearing a high-end plate carrier and a tactical helmet with integrated comms. He was a professional. He was fast. He wasn't fast enough. Elena fired 2 rounds. The suppressed asterisk thud-thud asterisk of the M4 was nearly lost in the sound of the rain. The man dropped without a sound, his rifle skidding across the mud. "Flank right," a voice shouted from the SUV. Elena didn't wait to be flanked. She lunged through the brush, her body low to the ground. She felt the impact of a bullet hitting a tree inches from her head, the wood splinters stinging her cheek. She didn't flinch. She counted the shots. 3, 4, 5. The second man was behind a cedar tree. Elena didn't try to shoot him. She waited for the friction. She listened to his breathing, the rustle of his gear, the click of his safety. She knew exactly where he was, not because she could see him, but because the world around him was distorted by his presence. She stepped out from behind a bush and fired a single shot. The man slumped against the cedar, his eyes wide with a shock he would never have time to process. "Miller, stay low," she shouted. She heard a roar, the sound of the black SUV's engine. The third man was trying to ram them. The vehicle tore through the brush, its headlights cutting through the gray mist like the eyes of a monster. Elena didn't run. She stood her ground, her M4 leveled at the driver's side window. She saw the driver's face, a hard, bearded man with a scar running through his eyebrow. He looked at her, and for a second she saw something in his eyes that wasn't professional. It was fear. She pulled the trigger. The windshield of the SUV shattered. The vehicle swerved, its tires losing purchase on the slick mud. It skidded toward the edge of the cliff, the engine screaming as the driver tried to regain control. For a heartbeat, the SUV balanced on the precipice, its front wheels spinning in the air. Then, it was gone. The sound of the impact was a dull, heavy thud followed by the roar of the surf. Then, silence. Elena stood in the rain, her chest heaving, her rifle still pointed at the empty trail. She stayed like that for a long minute, her ears ringing, the smell of cordite and wet earth filling her lungs. "Elena?" Miller crawled out of the brush, his face pale and streaked with mud. He looked at the empty trail, then at the bodies of the two men, then at Elena. He looked like he was seeing a stranger. "Is it over?" he asked. "No," Elena said. She lowered the rifle, her hands finally starting to shake. The broadcast was stopped, but the data is still in the bunker's buffer. If they have a backup power supply, they can restart the transmission. She looked toward the bunker. The concrete walls looked cold and impenetrable in the fading light. She knew what she had to do. She had to go inside. "I'm coming with you," Miller said. "No, you're going to take the radio and move back toward the main road. If I'm not out in 20 minutes, you find a way to reach the Coast Guard. Tell them everything." "Elena, you can't go in there alone. There could be more of them." "There are," she said, her voice hard. "I can hear them." She didn't wait for his argument. She turned and headed toward the bunker, her silhouette a dark shadow against the gray sky. The fence was easy to bypass. She used her multi-tool to cut a hole in the chain link, her movements precise and quiet. She reached the heavy steel door of the bunker and pressed her ear against it. She didn't hear voices. She heard the friction, the low hum of a diesel generator, the click-clack of cooling fans, and the rhythmic 4-2-second pulse of the server. She pulled a small explosive charge from her vest, a breaching charge she had borrowed from the QRF lockers months ago. She placed it on the hinges of the door, her fingers steady despite the cold. "Open up," she whispered. The explosion was a sharp, localized crack that sent a cloud of dust and metal shards into the air. Elena kicked the door open and moved inside, her rifle leading the way. The interior of the bunker was a nightmare of green light and shadow. Rows of server racks lined the walls, their cooling fans whirring like a swarm of angry hornets. In the center of the room, a large console was glowing with a series of rapidly scrolling numbers. "Don't move." The voice came from the shadows behind the console. Elena ducked behind a server rack just as a burst of fire tore through the plastic casing of the processors next to her. Sparks showered her ops, the smell of burning ozone filling the air. "You're a long way from the TOC, Staff Sergeant," the voice said. It was deep, calm, and hauntingly familiar. Elena froze. She knew that voice. She had heard it every day for the last year. "Major Thorne," she whispered. Thorne stepped into the green light of the console. He wasn't wearing his ops. He was wearing a black tactical suit, his face clean-shaven, his eyes cold and devoid of the arrogance she had come to expect from him. He looked like a different man. He looked like a hunter. "I told you that you were a witness, Elena," Thorne said, his pistol leveled at the rack she was hiding behind. "I just didn't realize how much you were willing to see." "You killed them," Elena said, her voice a low growl. "You killed 16 soldiers, your own people." "My people?" Thorne laughed, a dry, hollow sound. "The army is a machine, Elena, and machines break. I'm just making sure the pieces end up in the right hands. Do you have any idea what this data is worth? The entire Pacific defense architecture. The keys to the kingdom. It's worth 16 lives?" "It's worth the future," Thorne said. "The world is changing, Elena. The old hierarchies are crumbling. This data, It's the currency of the new world, and I'm not going to let a mid-level NCO with a knack for signals stop me from collecting. The broadcast is dead, Thorn, Elena said. I fried your arrays. For now, Thorn admitted. But the buffer is still full. All I have to do is restart the generator and bypass the fried circuits. It'll take me 5 minutes. 5 minutes to change the world. I won't let you. You're trapped in a concrete box with a man who has 20 years of combat experience and nothing to lose, Thorn said. How do you think this ends? Elena didn't answer. She was listening. She wasn't listening to Thorn. She was listening to the bunker. She heard the drip of water from a leaky pipe, the vibration of the generator, the hum of the servers, and something else. A high-pitched, nearly ultrasonic whine coming from the console. The friction. Thorn had been so focused on the data that he hadn't noticed the imbalance in the power grid. When Elena had hit the arrays with the counter signal, she hadn't just fried the satellite dishes. She had destabilized the entire power regulator for the bunker. The generator was running at 110% capacity, trying to compensate for a load that didn't exist anymore. The bunker wasn't just a listening post. It was a pressure cooker. It ends with a bang, Major, Elena said. She stepped out from behind the rack. She didn't raise her rifle. She looked at Thorn, her eyes steady, her face a mask of absolute, terrifying calm. Shoot me, she said. But if you do, you'll never see the spike. Thorn hesitated. He looked at the console, then back at Elena. What spike? The power regulator, Elena said, her voice a whisper. It's about to blow. If you don't shut down the generator in the next 30 seconds, this whole room is going to turn into a furnace. Thorn's eyes flickered with a momentary doubt. He looked at the console, his hand hovering over the keyboard. That was the only opening Elena needed. She lunged forward, her body moving with a speed that Thorn wasn't prepared for. She didn't use her rifle, she used her hands. She struck him in the throat, a sharp, precise blow that sent him reeling back against the console. Thorn gasped, his hand going to his neck. He tried to raise his pistol, but Elena was already there. She grabbed his wrist and twisted, the sound of the bones snapping echoing through the room. The pistol dropped to the floor. Thorn roared, a primal, animal sound, and threw a punch with his other hand. It caught Elena in the jaw, sending her spinning back against the server racks. She felt the copper taste of blood in her mouth, her vision swimming for a second, but she didn't stop. She couldn't stop. Thorn lunged for the pistol, but Elena kicked it across the floor. They crashed into each other, a tangle of limbs and fury in the green light of the bunker. Thorn was stronger, but Elena was faster. She used his own momentum against him, slamming him into the side of the console. The impact caused the console to spark, a shower of blue light illuminating Thorn's face. He looked at her, and for the first time she saw the realization in his eyes. The high-pitched whine was now a scream. Elena, stop! Thorn shouted, his voice cracking. We can both get out, we can share the data. Think about what we could do. I am thinking about it, Elena said. She reached out and grabbed a handful of wires from the back of the console. She didn't pull them, she crossed them. The explosion was a white-hot flash that threw both of them across the room. Elena felt the heat sear her skin, the force of the blast slamming her back against the concrete wall. She felt the air leave her lungs, her world turning into a blur of gray smoke and red fire. She lay on the floor, her body screaming in pain. She could smell her own hair burning, the acrid scent of melted plastic filling her nostrils. She tried to move, but her legs felt like they were made of lead. She looked across the room. Thorn was lying near the console, his body wreathed in smoke. He wasn't moving. The master of the signal had been silenced by the very thing he had tried to control. Elena forced herself to crawl. Every movement was a struggle, a battle against the darkness that was trying to pull her under. She reached the door of the bunker, the cool, rain-washed air hitting her face like a blessing. She pulled herself outside, her fingers digging into the mud. She collapsed on the grass, her eyes looking up at the gray sky. The 2-second pulse was gone. The world was silent. Elena! Miller was there, his face appearing in her blurred vision. He was crying, his hands shaking as he tried to lift her up. I'm here, she whispered, her voice a raspy shadow of itself. You did it, Miller sobbed. The signal's dead. I saw the flash from the road. You did it. Elena didn't answer. She looked toward the cape where the listening post was now a blackened shell against the sea. She felt the weight of the moment, the cost of the truth. She had lost everything she had worked for. Her career was over. She was a rogue soldier, a witness to a crime that the system would try to bury. But as she lay there in the rain, she felt a strange, crystalline peace. She had heard the friction, and she had fixed the clock. The immediate aftermath was a blur of sound and light. She remembered the sound of helicopters, real helicopters this time, the deep, rhythmic thrum of the Coast Guard Hueys. She remembered being lifted onto a stretcher, the feeling of a warm blanket being wrapped around her shivering body. She remembered the face of a young medic, his eyes wide with a mix of fear and respect. "Who is she?" the medic asked. "She's a staff sergeant," Miller's voice said, sounding stronger now, "and she just saved the world." Elena closed her eyes. She woke up 3 hours later in the back of a medical transport. Her body was a map of pain, second-degree burns on her arms, a possible concussion, a fractured wrist, but her mind was clear. She looked at the man sitting across from her. He wasn't a medic. He was wearing a dark suit, his face unreadable, his eyes fixed on a tablet in his lap. "Staff Sergeant Vance," he said, not looking up. "Who are you?" Elena asked. "My name is Agent Ross, National Security Agency." Elena felt a cold dread settle in her stomach. The reckoning had arrived. "You've caused quite a stir, Sergeant," Ross said, finally looking at her. "A destroyed TOC, a dead major, a fried Navy listening post. On paper, you're a terrorist." "I have the data," Elena said, her voice steady. "The real data, the logs from the server bridge, the coordinates of the package, it's all on the tablet." Ross looked at the tablet in his lap. "We found it in the Humvee. Your friend, Miller, he's been very vocal about what happened. Is he safe?" "He's being debriefed," Ross said, "as are you." He leaned forward, his face inches from hers. "There are people in D.C. who want you to disappear, Elena. People who were very invested in Major Thorne's little enterprise. They don't like witnesses. And they especially don't like witnesses who can rebuild a phase inverter out of spare parts." "I'm not a witness," Elena said. "I'm a soldier." Ross watched her for a long minute, his expression softening just a fraction of a millimeter. "Maybe, but the army doesn't know what to do with soldiers like you. You're too good, Elena. You see the things that the system is designed to hide." "So what happens now?" "Now," Ross said, standing up as the transport began to slow down, "we find out if the system is worth saving, or if it's time to start building a new one." He walked to the door of the transport and opened it. A blast of cold air hit Elena, and for a second, she was back on the Cape, listening to the roar of the Pacific. She saw a row of black SUVs waiting on the tarmac. She saw men in suits, men in uniforms, men with guns. They were all watching her. They were all waiting to see what she would do next. Elena Vance sat up, her body screaming in protest, her head throbbing with a rhythmic, pulsing pain. She looked at her hands, the hands that had fixed the clocks, the hands that had broken the major, the hands that had held the truth. She wasn't afraid. She stood up, her legs shaky but her back straight. She walked toward the door, her eyes fixed on the horizon. The crisis had passed. The broadcast had been stopped. But the war was just beginning. And as she stepped out into the light, Elena Vance knew one thing for certain. She was still listening. And she wasn't the only one. The silence on the tarmac was absolute. It was the silence of a room where everyone is pretending not to watch something they are all watching. Elena felt the weight of every gaze, every camera lens, every satellite fixating on her as she descended the ramp. She didn't look for Miller. She didn't look for a lawyer. She looked for the friction. She found it in the way Agent Ross stood, too stiff, his eyes darting toward the lead SUV. She found it in the way the soldiers on the perimeter held their rifles, not at her, but toward the tree line. She wasn't the prisoner. She was the prize. "Sergeant Vance," a new voice said. A woman stepped out from behind the lead SUV. She was older, with sharp features and hair the color of steel. She was wearing a general's stars on her shoulders, General Holloway, the head of Pacific Command's Intelligence Directorate. Elena stopped. She didn't salute. She didn't have the strength. She just stood there, a broken, burned soldier in the middle of a cold airfield. "General," Elena said. "You've made a mess of my exercise, Sergeant," Holloway said. Her voice was like dry parchment. "The exercise was a lie, General. Major Thorne was using it as a screen for a data heist." "I know," Holloway said. She walked up to Elena, her eyes scanning the burns on her arms. "We've been watching Thorne for 6 months. We knew he was dirty. We just didn't know who he was working for." Elena felt a surge of rage, cold, controlled, and precise. You knew he was a threat and you let him stay in the TOC? 16 people are dead, General. 16 of my people." "We needed the source, Sergeant," Holloway said, her voice never wavering. "Thorne was just a node. We needed to see the broadcast. We needed to follow the signal back to its origin. And you were willing to let 16 soldiers die for that." Holloway looked at the smoking ruin of the Cape in the distance. "In the world of signals intelligence, Sergeant, there is a cost for every truth. Sometimes that cost is measured in lives. You should know that better than anyone." "I do," Elena said. She took a step forward, her face inches from the general's. "And I also know that the signal didn't go back to a foreign power. It went to a private server in Arlington, your server, General." The silence that followed was different. It was the silence of a clock that had stopped ticking. Holloway didn't flinch, she didn't even blink. But Elena saw it, the tiny 12-millisecond delay in her response. The friction. "You're tired, Sergeant," Holloway said. "You've been through a traumatic event. You're seeing things that aren't there." "I'm seeing everything," Elena said. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the challenge coin. She didn't show it to the general. She felt the weight of it, the cold metal a reminder of where she came from. "The signal is still out there, General," Elena said, her voice a low, steady promise. "I didn't just stop the broadcast, I mirrored it, every byte of data that Thorne tried to send. It's sitting on a secure, encrypted drive in a location you'll never find." Holloway's eyes narrowed. "You're bluffing." "Am I?" Elena smiled, that thin, hard line that never reached her eyes. "Why don't you check your personal tablet, General? The one you keep in your desk in Hawaii? I think you'll find a 2-second pulse waiting for you." Holloway stared at her, the mask finally starting to crack. She looked at Agent Ross, then back at Elena. She realized then that she wasn't dealing with a staff sergeant. She was dealing with the daughter of a clockmaker who had just rebuilt the world. "What do you want?" Holloway whispered. "I want the names," Elena said. "Everyone who was on that payroll, everyone who knew about the TOC, and I want Miller protected. If anything happens to him, if he so much as trips on a sidewalk, the broadcast goes live to every news agency from New York to Tokyo." Holloway looked at the airfield, the SUVs, the soldiers. She looked at the power she had spent 40 years building, and she saw it for what it was, a machine that was about to break. "Fine," she said. She turned and walked back toward the SUV, her movements stiff and mechanical. Elena stood on the tarmac, the rain starting to fall again. She felt the exhaustion finally hitting her, the adrenaline fading into a deep, hollow ache. She looked at Agent Ross, who was still standing by the transport. "You're a dangerous woman, Elena," Ross said. "I'm just a woman who can hear the friction," she replied. She watched the SUVs drive away, the tail lights disappearing into the mist. She was still standing. Barely, but she was standing. The institutional reckoning hadn't arrived yet. The long aftermath was still to come. The future was a gray, uncertain expanse as wide and deep as the Pacific. But as Elena Vance turned and walked toward the medical tent, she felt the rhythm of her own heart, steady, certain, and true. The signal was gone. The noise was silent. But for the first time in her life, she knew exactly what time it was. The plastic taste of the oxygen cannula was the first thing Elena Vance registered when the world finally stopped ringing. A thin, clinical saltiness that sat at the back of her throat like a warning. She lay in a sterile, white-walled room at Madigan Army Medical Center, watching a single bead of condensation crawl down the side of a saline bag, counting the seconds of its descent against the rhythmic, mechanical thrum of the hospital's HVAC system. It was 04:14 on a Tuesday morning, exactly 72 hours since she had walked off the tarmac at McCord Field. And in that time, the United States Army had systematically begun the process of erasing the woman who had saved the Pacific Fleet. They hadn't taken her rank yet, but they had taken her boots, her belt, and her phone, replacing the heavy, familiar weight of her gear with the thin, paper blue vulnerability of a patient's gown. To the nurses, she was a burn victim in room 412. To the 2 MPs standing outside her door with their heels locked and their faces set like stone, She was a person of interest who was not to be left alone with a sharp object or a live data port. The institutional response was a cold, silent machine that moved with the terrifying efficiency of a surgical strike. It didn't start with a shout or a public arrest. It started with the quiet revocation of her security clearances. By the time Elena had been stabilized in the ER, her common access card had been flagged, her Nipper account deleted, and her name removed from the duty roster of the 201st Expeditionary Intelligence Brigade as if she were a clerical error that had finally been corrected. This was the military's way of handling a variable it couldn't control, by treating the individual like a localized infection that needed to be quarantined before it could spread to the rest of the body. The brass didn't care about the 16 lives lost at the TOC yet. They cared about the narrative, and the narrative currently dictated that a staff sergeant had gone rogue, destroyed a multi-million-dollar Navy asset, and was now being held for her own protection and the protection of the service. The door to her room opened with a soft, pneumatic hiss that set Elena's teeth on edge. She didn't turn her head. She knew the frequency of the hinges, the specific weight of the footsteps entering the room. It wasn't a nurse. The stride was too heavy, the soles of the shoes too hard against the linoleum. It was a man who had spent 30 years walking down corridors where people were expected to move out of his way. "You're awake," the man said. It wasn't a question. Elena shifted, a searing line of pain radiating from the second-degree burns on her forearms where the blast from the bunker had cooked the skin through her sleeves. She looked at the man. He was wearing a charcoal gray suit that probably cost more than her annual base pay, his silver hair cropped in a perfect, aggressive high-end height. He didn't introduce himself. He didn't need to. He carried the aura of the Pentagon's Office of General Counsel, the kind of man who was sent to ensure that the truth was tailored to fit the needs of the institution. "The doctors say you'll have some scarring on the arms, but the mobility in your hands should return to 90% within a month," the man said, pulling a chair toward the bed with a screech that made Elena flinch. He sat down, opening a leather-bound folder. "I'm here to discuss the statement you gave to Agent Ross, specifically the parts regarding General Holloway and the mirrored data." "I'm not changing it," Elena said. Her voice was a dry rasp, the vocal cords still irritated by the smoke she'd inhaled in the bunker. "Staff Sergeant, let's be very clear about where you stand," the man said, leaning forward. His eyes were the color of a winter sea, cold and devoid of empathy. "You are currently being investigated for 3 counts of destruction of government property, 1 count of unauthorized use of lethal force, and 24 violations of the National Security Act. Major Thorne is dead. The TOC is a pile of ash, and the only witness who supports your version of events is a corporal who is currently undergoing psychiatric evaluation for acute stress disorder. In the eyes of the JAG Corps, you are a liability that is becoming increasingly expensive to maintain." "The data exists," Elena said, her eyes fixed on the man's tie. It was a subtle silk weave, a pattern that felt like noise. "I didn't just stop the broadcast. I captured the handshake. I have the IP addresses of the servers that were receiving the telemetry from the Pacific Net. One of them belongs to a shell company owned by a contractor who sits on General Holloway's advisory board. You can try to bury me, but you can't bury the signal. It's already out there." The man in the suit paused, his pen hovering over the folder. The room was silent for 6 beats of the heart. Elena heard the friction, then the tiny, microscopic hesitation in his breathing. He wasn't there to prosecute her. He was there to find out how much damage she could still do. "The general has a very long and distinguished career," the man said, his voice dropping an octave. "The institution does not take kindly to people who attempt to dismantle that career based on technical anomalies. If you were to provide us with the location of this supposed encrypted drive, and if you were to sign a non-disclosure agreement regarding the events at Knee Bay, the Army would be willing to overlook the procedural lapses that occurred during your time on the peninsula. You would be medically retired with full benefits. A clean break, no court-martial, no prison time." "And the 16 soldiers at the TOC?" Elena asked. "Do they get a clean break? Or do they just get a folded flag and a lie told to their families?" Their families will be told they died in the line of duty during a classified training exercise. The man said, his voice hardening. That is the highest honor they can receive. Don't make the mistake of thinking your personal sense of morality outweighs the stability of the command structure, Vance. You're a technician. You fix clocks. You don't get to decide how the time is spent. He stood up, leaving the folder open on the table. Inside was a single sheet of paper, a voluntary separation agreement. It was the institutional equivalent of a burial shroud. Sign it, and the world goes back to normal. Refuse, and the machine starts to grind. Think about it, the man said. You have 48 hours before the formal charges are read. After that, the door closes. He left without another word, the door hissing shut behind him. Elena lay back against the pillows, her breath coming in shallow, ragged bursts. The cost of the truth was finally settling in, and it was heavier than the gear she'd carried through the mud of Cape Flattery. She felt a profound, hollow loneliness, the kind that only comes when you realize that the organization you gave your life to is more afraid of your competence than it is appreciative of your loyalty. She closed her eyes and tried to find the rhythm, but for the first time in her life, the world felt out of sync. The hospital was a chaotic mess of frequencies, the hum of the monitors, the distant chatter of the nurses, the squeak of a cleaning cart. It was all noise. There was no signal. She was a woman who could hear the friction of the universe, but she couldn't hear a way out of this room. 2 hours later, a nurse came in to change her dressings. She was an older woman, a civilian with a kind face and hands that smelled of lavender and antiseptic. She worked in silence, her eyes focused on the raw, red skin of Elena's forearms. She didn't look at the MP standing by the door. She didn't look at the security camera in the corner. As she wrapped the fresh gauze around Elena's left arm, she leaned in close, her voice a barely audible whisper that was lost under the sound of the air vent. "There's a man in the waiting room," the nurse said. "He's been there since they brought you in. He won't leave. He says he has something for you, but they won't let him through." "Miller?" Elena whispered. He didn't give a name. "He's just a boy in a muddy uniform with eyes like he's seen the end of the world. He told me to tell you that the clock is still ticking. He said you'd know what that means." The nurse finished the dressing and stood up, her face returning to a professional mask. She patted Elena's hand once, a quick, human touch that felt like an electric shock, and then she was gone. Elena felt a sudden, sharp pang of hope that was almost as painful as the burns. Miller was alive. He was there, and he was still holding the line. But the cost for him would be just as high. He was a corporal, a kid with a bright future, and a family back in Ohio who expected him to come home a hero. If he stayed loyal to her, the institution would crush him just as surely as it was trying to crush her. They would label him unstable, strip him of his rank, and send him back to civilian life with a dishonorable discharge that would haunt him for the rest of his days. She didn't want that for him. She didn't want his name to be the 17th one on the list of things she had lost. By the second day, the physical isolation began to merge with a psychological wearing down that Elena knew was intentional. The lights in her room were never fully dimmed. People entered at all hours to check her vitals, to ask her the same 5 questions about her orientation, to remind her that she was a patient who was also a prisoner. They were trying to break her rhythm, to make the internal clock she relied on falter until she was willing to sign anything just to make the noise stop. In the afternoon, the door opened again, but this time it wasn't the man in the suit. It was a man in a uniform, Colonel Shepard, the commander of the 201st. He was a man Elena had respected, a leader who had always prided himself on knowing his NCOs by name. He stood at the foot of the bed, his cap tucked under his arm, looking at her with an expression that was half pity and half betrayal. "Sergeant Vance," he said softly. "Colonel, I've just come from the memorial service for the 16, he said. He looked older than he had a week ago, the lines around his eyes deeper, his shoulders slightly slumped. It was a difficult afternoon. General Holloway gave the eulogy. She spoke about sacrifice, about the hidden costs of vigilance. Elena felt a cold, jagged spike of rage rotate in her chest. She spoke about the people she helped kill. Shepard sighed, a long, weary sound. "Elena, listen to me. I've read the prelims. I've seen the logs from the Cape. I know you think you saw something. I know you think Thorn was part of some larger conspiracy. But you have to understand the position this puts the brigade in. If we acknowledge that a major under my command was a traitor and that a general was involved, the entire intelligence architecture of this command collapses. Investigations will go on for years. Alliances will be strained. Our enemies will see a window of opportunity while we're busy tearing ourselves apart. So the solution is to let the traitor win? Elena asked. To let Holloway keep her stars while Sarah and the others are buried under a lie? The solution is to protect the mission, Shepard said, his voice gaining a hard, professional edge. The mission is bigger than any one person. It's bigger than Thorn. It's bigger than you. We have already neutralized the threat. The broadcast was stopped. The data is secure. Whatever Holloway's involvement was, it will be handled internally. Quietly, in a way that doesn't compromise the United States Army. You're protecting the institution, Colonel, not the truth. They are the same thing, Sergeant, Shepard said. He stepped closer, his voice dropping. I'm trying to save you. If this goes to a general court-martial, they will destroy you. They will make you out to be a delusional, violent woman who cracked under the pressure of the signal. They will bring up your father. They will bring up your history of unorthodox methods. You will lose everything. Sign the paper. Go home to Montana. Let this go. He waited for a response, his eyes searching hers for some sign of the disciplined soldier he thought he knew. But Elena wasn't that soldier anymore. She was the woman who had stood in the green light of the bunker and watched the world fold. She was the one who knew that once you see the friction, you can never go back to believing the clock is perfect. I can't let it go, Colonel, she said, because I'm the only one who can still hear it. Shepard's face hardened. He put his cap on, the brim shadowing his eyes. Then you're on your own, Sergeant. I can't help a woman who refuses to be saved. He turned and walked out, his boots clicking with a finality that felt like a gavel hitting a block. The personal cost arrived in full that night. The pain in her arms became a secondary concern to the crushing weight of the silence. She sat in the dark, watching the red power light on the wall monitor, her mind replaying the moment the TOC went dark. She saw Sarah's face. She heard the sound of the explosion. She felt the specific, hollow vibration of 16 souls being extinguished in a heartbeat. She was the survivor, but the survival felt like a punishment. She was the one left to carry the weight of what they had known, and she was doing it in a room where even the air felt like it belonged to someone else. She thought about her father's workshop. She remembered the smell of machine oil and the steady, reassuring asterisk tick-tock asterisk of a dozen different timepieces all trying to agree on the same moment. He had taught her that a clock isn't just a tool, it's a promise. A promise that order exists in a world of chaos. And when a clock breaks, you don't just throw it away. You find the gear that failed. You find the friction. Holloway was the friction. The institution was the broken gear. And she was the only one who knew how to fix it, even if it meant she had to break herself in the process. Around 0200, the door opened again. This time, there was no hiss. The door was opened slowly, carefully, as if the person on the other side was trying to avoid the frequency of the hinges. It was Miller. He looked terrible. He was still in his ocs, but they were wrinkled and stained with salt and mud. His face was gaunt, his eyes bloodshot and rimmed with a desperate, frantic energy. He slipped into the room and closed the door softly, leaning his back against it as he looked at Elena. "They're moving me, Elena," he whispered, his voice shaking. "I've been reassigned to a motor pool in Fort Riley. My orders came through an hour ago. I have to be on a transport at 0600. "Miller, you shouldn't be here," Elena said, her heart hammering against her ribs. "If they catch you?" "I don't care," he said. He crossed the room and sat on the edge of the bed, his hands clenching and unclenching in his lap. "They've been questioning me for 48 hours straight. Different guys, every time. They keep telling me I'm confused. They keep saying the explosion at the TOC was a propane leak. They told me that if I keep talking about a signal, they'll have to put me in a long-term psych ward for observation." He looked at her, his eyes welling with tears. "They're trying to make me crazy, Elena, and I'm starting to believe them. Did it really happen? Were we really at the Cape? Did you really kill Thorn?" Elena reached out with her bandaged hand and gripped his arm. The pain was sharp, but she didn't let go. She needed him to feel her. She needed him to know she was real. "It happened, Miller," she said, her voice a low, steady anchor. "Every word of it. The signal was real, the betrayal was real, and the 16 people we lost, they were real. Don't let them take that from you. That's the only thing they can't steal, the truth of what you saw." Miller wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. "They took my phone, Elena. They wiped my laptop. Everything I had from the TOC, it's gone." "It's not gone," she said. She leaned in closer, her voice a ghost of a sound. "The tablet from the Humvee, the one Ross took, he thinks he has the only copy. But I didn't just mirror the data to a drive, Miller. I didn't tell Holloway the whole truth." Miller looked at her, his breath hitching. "What do you mean? Before we hit the Cape, when I was retuning that handheld radio, I wasn't just building an inverter. I was setting a relay. Every packet of data that went through my laptop during the broadcast was fragmented and sent out over the shortwave bands. It wasn't sent to one place. It was sent to 100, to 1,000. Miller's eyes widened. The HAM radio community? The enthusiasts, the sky watchers, the people who listen to the static because they're bored or curious, Elena said. "I used a steganographic trigger. To them, it looks like background radiation, but if you have the key I carved into the back of your challenge coin, you can pull those fragments back together. You can rebuild the signal." She let go of his arm and reached for the small metal coin sitting on her bedside table. It was the only personal item they hadn't taken, thinking it was just a piece of military trivia. She handed it to him. "Take it," she said. "Go to Riley. Do your time in the motor pool. Keep your head down. Don't say another word about signals or Holloway, but keep that coin. When the time is right, when the noise dies down, you find someone who can listen, you find the friction." Miller took the coin, his fingers trembling as he felt the tiny, precise grooves she had etched into the metal with her multi-tool in the back of the Humvee. He looked at her, a profound sense of awe and terror in his eyes. "You're not signing the paper, are you?" he asked. "No," Elena said. "I'm staying. I'm going to let them read the charges. I'm going to let them put me on the stand. I'm going to make them say the names of the 16 in a room where the transcript never goes away." "They'll destroy you, Elena. They can destroy the soldier," she said, her voice a cold, hard promise. "But they can't stop the clock. It's already been set, Miller, and it doesn't need me to keep ticking." The door hissed open, and the 2 MPs stepped into the room, their faces tight with anger. They grabbed Miller by the arms, pulling him away from the bed. "Corporal, you were told to stay in your quarters," one of the MPs barked. "I'm going," Miller shouted, his eyes locked on Elena's as they dragged him toward the door. "I'm going. Elena, I'll remember, I won't forget." The door slammed shut, and Elena was alone again. The silence was absolute, but it was no longer heavy. It was the silence of a room where a secret was hidden, a silence that felt like the moment before a storm breaks. The next morning, the man in the suit returned. He looked at the unsigned separation agreement on the table and then at Elena. He didn't seem surprised. He seemed disappointed, the way a mechanic is disappointed when a part refuses to fit into a machine. "You've made a very poor decision, Staff Sergeant," he said. "I've made the only one that was available," she replied. "Very well. The Article 32 hearing is scheduled for tomorrow at 09:00. You will be transported to the brig at JBLM this afternoon. Since you have declined representation from the JAG Corps, the court will appoint a defense counsel for you, but I wouldn't expect a spirited defense. This is a formality, Vance, a precursor to your permanent removal from the service." "I understand," Elena said. She watched him leave, her eyes tracing the pattern of his suit one last time. She felt a strange sense of clarity, a narrowing of her world that reminded her of the moments before she took a shot or decoded a pulse. The institutional response had been exactly what she expected. It was predictable, rigid, and ultimately flawed. It relied on the assumption that she wanted to survive. It didn't account for the possibility that she was willing to be the gear that broke the machine. The transport arrived at 14:00. Elena was dressed in a standard-issue orange jumpsuit, her hands cuffed in front of her, her bandaged arms a vivid contrast against the bright fabric. She was led through the hospital corridors, past the nurses who looked away and the doctors who looked through her. She felt like a ghost haunting the halls of her own life. As she was being loaded into the back of a secure van, she saw General Holloway. The general was standing near the helipad, surrounded by a group of high-ranking officers. She was laughing at something one of them had said, her stars catching the pale Washington sunlight. She looked untouchable. She looked like the embodiment of the institution, strong, stable, and permanent. Then she turned her head. Her eyes met Elena's across the tarmac. For a split second, the laughter died on Holloway's face. She looked at the orange jumpsuit, the handcuffs, the woman who had been erased. And in that second, Elena saw it again. The friction. Holloway knew. She knew the drive in her office was just the beginning. She knew that Elena Vance wasn't a victim. She was a countdown. Elena didn't say a word. She didn't have to. She simply looked at the general, her face a mask of absolute, terrifying calm, and for a heartbeat, she let the rhythm of her own heart match the 4-2-second pulse of the signal. The van door slammed shut, plunging her into darkness. The brig at JBLM was a different kind of silence. It was the silence of the earth, of a place designed to hold things that the world wanted to forget. Elena was placed in a single cell, a concrete box with a steel cot and a toilet that flushed with a violent mechanical roar. There were no windows, no clocks, no frequencies. She sat on the cot, her back against the cold wall, and waited. She spent the night counting. She counted her breaths. She counted the hum of the light in the hallway. She counted the seconds between the guards' footsteps. She was rebuilding her world, one tick at a time, ensuring that when she stepped into that courtroom, she would be the most precise thing in the room. The personal cost was undeniable. She was 32 years old, and she was sitting in a cell, her career in ruins, her body scarred, her friends dead. She had no one left to call, no one to hold. She was a woman who had been stripped of everything except the truth, and she was starting to realize that the truth was a cold, lonely thing to live for. But as the hours passed, she felt something else stirring inside her. It wasn't rage. It wasn't fear. It was a dark, quiet competence that she hadn't known she possessed. She had always been the technician, the one who fixed the clocks, but now she was the one who was going to decide what the time meant. At 08:00 the next morning, the cell door opened. Two guards stood there, their faces unreadable. "Time to go, Vance," one of them said. They led her down a series of gray corridors to a small, wood-paneled courtroom. It was a stark, functional space, filled with the smell of old paper and floor wax. There was no gallery, no press, just a judge's bench, a witness stand, and 2 tables for the counsel. Sitting at the prosecution table was the man in the charcoal suit. Sitting at the defense table was a young captain, a woman with nervous eyes and a briefcase that looked too big for her. And sitting in the back of the room, in the shadows of the doorway, was General Holloway. The judge entered, a silver-haired colonel named Sterling. He looked at Elena with a weary, professional detachment as he called the hearing to order. "Staff Sergeant Elena Vance," Sterling said, his voice echoing in the small room. "You are here for an Article 32 hearing to determine if there is sufficient evidence to proceed to a general court-martial for the charges laid against you. How do you plead?" Elena stood up. Her hands were still cuffed, but she held them in front of her like a shield. She looked at the judge, then at the man in the suit, and finally at Holloway. "I don't plead, Colonel," Elena said, her voice clear and resonant, filling the room with a frequency that silenced everything else. The judge frowned. "Sergeant, this is a formal proceeding. You must enter a plea of guilty or not guilty." "I am here to discuss the signal," Elena said. She felt the friction in the room suddenly spike. The man in the suit leaned forward, his face tightening. Holloway shifted in her seat, her eyes narrowing. "Sergeant Vance, you are out of order," the judge warned. The signal began at 03:14 on the morning of the 14th, Elena said, her voice never wavering. It was a 4-2-second pulse, encrypted using a 28-bit rolling key that was synchronized with the Pacific Command's heartbeat monitor. It wasn't a glitch. It wasn't a propane leak. It was a heist. "Silence!" the judge shouted, slamming his gavel, but Elena didn't stop. She couldn't stop. She was the daughter of a clockmaker, and she had found the friction. The data was mirrored to 3 separate nodes, she said, her voice rising above the sound of the gavel. The first was Thorne's laptop, the second was the Cape relay, and the third was a secure server located at 1200 Navy Annex, Arlington, the office of the Directorate of Intelligence. The room went deathly silent. Holloway stood up, her face a mask of cold fury. This is a travesty. This woman is mentally unstable. Close this hearing immediately. The judge looked at Holloway, then at the man in the suit, then back at Elena. He saw the way she was standing, not like a prisoner, but like a woman who was holding a live wire. He saw the burns on her arms. He saw the clarity in her eyes. And for the first time in 30 years, Colonel Sterling felt the friction of the machine he served. "Sit down, General," Sterling said softly. "What?" Holloway hissed. "I said sit down," Sterling repeated, his voice gaining a hard, sudden authority. He looked at Elena. "Sergeant Vance, you are making a very serious allegation. Do you have any evidence to support the existence of this third node?" Elena looked at Holloway. She saw the fear behind the general's eyes, the realization that the erased woman was still there. She felt the weight of the 16 names in her heart, the cost of the last 72 hours, and the hope that was still flickering in the dark. "I don't have the evidence," Elena said. A wave of relief washed over Holloway's face. The man in the suit smirked. "But the HAM radio operators in 48 states do," Elena finished. The smirk vanished. The room felt like it had suddenly lost all oxygen. "As of 0600 this morning," Elena said, her voice a low, steady drone of a countdown. "A fragmented data packet was released onto the public bands. It's an encrypted file, Colonel. It contains the complete log of the broadcast, including the IP addresses, the timestamps, and the digital signature of the receiver at the Navy Annex. There is only one way to decrypt that file." She looked at the judge, a thin, hard smile finally touching her lips. "You have to ask General Holloway for her challenge coin." The silence that followed was the longest silence Elena had ever heard. It was the silence of a clock that had finally, irrevocably, stopped. Holloway looked like she was about to speak, her mouth opening and closing as she searched for a lie that was big enough to save her. But there were no lies left. The signal was out there, moving at the speed of light, crossing borders and boundaries that the institution couldn't control. The friction had become a fire, and the machine was starting to melt. The judge looked at Holloway, then at the man in the suit. He saw the truth in their faces, not because they admitted it, but because they couldn't hide the cost of it anymore. "This hearing is recessed," Sterling said, his voice sounding hollow. "The defendant will be returned to her cell. General Holloway, you are to remain in this building until further notice." He left the bench without looking back. The guards stepped forward, their movements hesitant now. They didn't grab Elena. They didn't bark orders. They simply gestured for her to follow them. As she was led out of the courtroom, Elena passed General Holloway. The general was still standing, her hands gripping the back of the chair so hard her knuckles were white. She looked at Elena, and for the first time she wasn't seeing a staff sergeant. She was seeing the woman who had broken her. "You've destroyed everything," Holloway whispered, her voice a jagged sliver of hate. "The institution, the command, it will take years to recover from this. You've crippled us." "No," Elena said, her voice a calm, final tick. "I just fixed the clock." She walked out into the hallway, the sound of her own footsteps echoing against the gray walls. She was still in an orange jumpsuit. She was still facing a dozen charges. She was still a woman who had lost everything she had ever worked for. But as the heavy steel door of the brig closed behind her, Elena Vance sat down on her cot and closed her eyes. She didn't count her breaths. She didn't count the guards' footsteps. She simply listened to the silence. And for the first time in her life, the silence was perfect. She waited in the cell for 4 days. No one came to see her. The meals were delivered through the slot in the door. The lights were never turned off. But the pressure had shifted. She could feel it in the way the guards moved. The hesitation, the hushed whispers in the hallway, the way they looked at her through the small window in the door with a mix of awe and terror. Something was happening on the outside. The machine was grinding, but the sound was different. It was the sound of gears stripping, of a system trying to figure out how to survive a catastrophe it had created for itself. On the 5th day, the door didn't just open. It was unlocked by a man she didn't recognize, a major with the silver oak leaves of the CID on his shoulders. He didn't have a charcoal suit. He didn't have a folder. He had a set of ox in his hands. "Staff Sergeant Vance," the major said. His voice was tired but professional. The charges against you have been stayed pending a full investigation by the Department of Justice. Elena stood up, her body stiff from the days of sitting in the dark. And General Holloway? The major looked at the floor for a second. General Holloway has been placed on administrative leave. The Navy Annex was raided at 0400 yesterday morning. They found the server. They found the logs. He looked at her then, his eyes searching hers for some sign of triumph, but he found nothing but the same steady calm. You were right, Sergeant, he said. About everything. I know, she said. She took the ox from his hands. They were clean, smelling of starch and a life she no longer felt a part of. She put them on, the familiar weight of the fabric a strange, heavy comfort. She felt the empty space where her unit patches should be, the rough Velcro a reminder of the identity she had lost. There's a car waiting for you, the major said. You're being moved to a safe house in Seattle. You'll be under federal protection until the grand jury convenes. And Miller? Corporal Miller is being returned from Fort Riley. He's going to be the lead witness for the prosecution. He says he owes you a beer. Elena felt a small, genuine smile touch her lips. It was the first one that felt like it belonged to the woman she used to be. As she walked out of the brig, she saw the world again. The green trees of the Pacific Northwest, the gray sky, the cold, wet air that tasted like freedom and cost. She saw the soldiers on the base going about their day, unaware that the world they served had been fundamentally changed by a woman in a concrete box. She was led to a black SUV, but before she got in, she stopped. She looked toward the horizon, toward the place where the Pacific Ocean met the sky. She thought about the 16 names. She thought about the signal. She thought about the cost of being right in a world that wanted her to be wrong. She wasn't the same woman who had entered the TOC a week ago. She was something else now, a witness, a survivor, a ghost who had learned how to scream in the frequency of the truth. The major opened the door for her. Are you ready, Sergeant? Elena Vance looked at him, then at the SUV, and finally at the sky. She felt the rhythm of the world, the friction, the pulse, the steady, unerring tick of a clock that was finally telling the truth. I'm ready, she said. But as she sat in the back of the SUV, watching the gates of JBLM disappear in the rearview mirror, Elena felt a sudden, sharp pang of realization. The broadcast hadn't just been a heist. It hadn't just been a conspiracy by a rogue general. The data she had captured, the fragments she had sent out to the world, they contained something else. Something she hadn't had time to decode in the bunker. Something that Holloway had been more afraid of than the exposure of her own corruption. There was a fourth node. And as the SUV hit the highway, heading north toward the city, Elena Vance felt the hair on her arms stand up. She wasn't done listening. The real signal was just beginning to arrive. The rain in Seattle didn't fall so much as it materialized. A fine, gray suspension that blurred the edges of the Space Needle and turned the surface of the I-5 into a shimmering ribbon of mercury. From the back of the black Suburban, Elena Vance watched the rhythmic sweep of the windshield wipers, her mind automatically syncing with the cadence, one stroke every 8 seconds. It was a slow, funeral pace, a frequency of mourning that matched the leaden weight in her chest. She was wearing the clean ox the CID major had given her, but they felt like a costume, a borrowed skin that didn't quite fit the woman who had survived the bunker at Knee Bay. Her forearms, wrapped in fresh, clinical white gauze beneath her sleeves, throbbed with a dull, insistent heat, a reminder that while the fire was out, the burn remained. The safe house was a nondescript brick triplex in Queen Anne, tucked away at the end of a cul-de-sac, where the only sound was the distant hum of the city's power grid and the occasional cry of a gull. Agent Henderson, a man with the weary eyes of a career Federalist and a suit that smelled faintly of peppermint and cedar, led her inside. He didn't use a key. He used a biometric pad that beeped with a high-pitched 3.2 kilohertz chirp, a sound Elena felt in her back teeth. You'll stay here for the duration, Henderson said, gesturing to a sparsely furnished living room that overlooked the Puget Sound. 2 marshals on the perimeter, one in the downstairs unit. No phone, no internet, no outgoing mail. We've stocked the kitchen. If you need anything specific, you tell me. We're not here to make you a prisoner, Sergeant, but the people Holloway was dealing with, they don't like loose ends. I'm not a loose end, Elena said, her voice sounding strange and small in the quiet room. "I'm the witness." "In this town, they are the same thing," Henderson replied. He lingered by the door, his hand resting on the frame. "For what it's worth, my daughter is an ensign on the USS Ronald Reagan. She's in the Pacific right now. If what you said in that courtroom is true, if that signal was meant to blind the fleet, then I guess I owe you more than a safe house." He left before she could respond, the heavy deadbolt sliding home with a metallic thud that echoed through the house. Elena stood by the window, watching the rain. She could feel the house around her, the vibration of the refrigerator, the faint whistle of wind through the window seals, the low-frequency thrum of the city's heart. But beneath it all, there was a ghost. A residual echo of the data she had fragmented and sent into the world. It was the fourth node. She sat on the edge of the sofa, closing her eyes, letting her consciousness narrow until the room disappeared and she was back in the green light of the bunker. She replayed the handshake, the 2-second pulse that had nearly cost her life. Holloway's corruption was the surface, the greed of a general selling telemetry to a contractor. But as Elena's mind mapped the architecture of the signal one more time, she realized the terrifying truth she'd missed in the heat of the blast. The telemetry wasn't just being sold. It was being used to feed a dead man's switch embedded in the Pacific Command's tactical grid. It was called Aegis Vanguard, a classified, automated escalation protocol designed to take over the fleet's response if the chain of command was decapitated. Holloway hadn't just been stealing. She had been spoofing the heartbeat of the command, making the Vanguard protocol believe everything was normal while she siphoned the data. But now that Holloway was neutralized and the Navy Annex server was seized, the heartbeat had stopped. To the Vanguard protocol, the silence wouldn't look like a legal victory. It would look like the United States had been wiped out by a first strike. The fourth node wasn't a server, it was a trigger, and it was already counting down. Elena opened her eyes. The room was dark, the sun having set behind the thick Pacific clouds. She checked the wall clock. 1942. If the Vanguard protocol followed the standard military redundancy cycle, it would wait exactly 12 hours from the last successful handshake before initiating the Response Alpha sequence, an automated launch of interceptors, and a total blackout of civilian communications in the Pacific theater to clear the bands for war. She had 4 hours left. The personal cost of the last week hit her then, a wave of exhaustion so profound she felt her knees buckle. She could stay here. She could let the marshals protect her. She could let the DOJ and the CID stumble their way through the logs until they realized, too late, that the machine was waking up. She had done her part. She had sacrificed her career, her friends, and her safety. She was a staff sergeant in an orange jumpsuit 5 days ago. She wasn't the commander-in-chief. But as she looked at the gauze on her arms, she thought about the 16 soldiers at the TOC. She thought about Sarah, who had died trying to keep the fans running. Sarah wouldn't have stayed on the sofa. Sarah would have found the frequency. Elena stood up. She didn't have her gear. She didn't have her laptop. She had a kitchen full of groceries and a house full of safe furniture. But she was the daughter of a man who could fix a grandfather clock with a toothpick and a prayer. Order existed in a world of chaos, and she was the one who knew where the friction lived. She went to the kitchen. She bypassed the food and went for the electronics. She found a microwave, a digital toaster, and a battery-powered emergency radio. She took a steak knife from the drawer and began to disassemble the microwave, her movements precise and practiced, her hands steady despite the throbbing in her burns. She needed the magnetron. She needed the copper wiring. She needed a way to broadcast a 14. 2 Hz override pulse, the stand-down code she had seen buried in the sublayers of the Holloway data. As she worked, the sound of the house changed. The marshals outside were shifting position. She heard the crunch of gravel under a heavy boot. Marshal Davis, the younger one, the one who liked to whistle the Star-Spangled Banner when he thought no one was listening. He was 180 pounds, walking with a slight limp in his left leg. She knew him by his frequency. She stripped the wires with the steak knife, the copper gleaming like a new penny in the dim light of the under-cabinet LEDs. She was building a crude, high-gain directional transmitter. It wouldn't reach the Pacific Fleet, but it would reach the nearest relay station, a secure Navy tower on top of Queen Anne Hill, less than half a mile away. If she could inject the override pulse into that tower, it would propagate through the tactical grid like a virus, reaching the Vanguard protocol before the 12-hour timer expired. The cost of this was clear. The moment she activated the magnetron, she would fry every electronic device in the safe house and probably trigger a silent alarm at the marshal's post. They would think she was being attacked or that she was trying to escape. They would come through the door with weapons drawn, and if she failed to explain herself in the 3 seconds it took for them to see a disassembled microwave and a pile of wires, she would be the 17th name on the list. She didn't hesitate. She was a soldier of the 201st. The mission was bigger than the woman. At 23:14, the device was ready. It was a jagged, ugly thing, a skeletal arrangement of copper and circuitry taped to the emergency radio's antenna. Elena carried it to the upstairs balcony, the cold rain soaking her ox in seconds. She looked toward the Navy tower, a red light blinking in the mist like a warning eye. She took a breath, the cold air stinging her lungs. She felt the rhythm of the world one last time, the 60 hertz hum of the power lines, the 1.8-second sweep of the wipers on a distant car, the 72 beats per minute thud of her own heart. She adjusted the coil, her fingers tracing the path of the pulse she was about to release. For the 16, she whispered. She triggered the battery. There was no sound, but the world suddenly tilted. The streetlights in the cul-de-sac flickered and died. The digital clock on the oven downstairs let out a dying whine. In Elena's head, the ghost frequency she had been carrying for days suddenly amplified. A roar of white noise that felt like a physical blow. She braced her hands against the balcony railing, her teeth gritted against the surge of electromagnetic interference. Below her, the front door of the triplex exploded inward. Federal marshals, hands in the air. Elena didn't move. She couldn't. She was focused on the red light of the Navy tower. For 3 agonizing seconds, nothing happened. The light continued its steady, rhythmic blink. Then, as the boots thundered up the stairs, the red light turned solid. It stayed solid for 5 seconds, then shifted to a calm, steady green. The override had been accepted. The Vanguard was back in its cage. The bedroom door flew open. Marshal Davis and Agent Henderson were there, their tactical lights blindingly bright in the darkness. Henderson had his sidearm drawn, his face a mask of adrenaline and confusion. He saw Elena standing on the balcony, the rain-slicked ox clinging to her frame, her hands empty except for a pile of smoking electronic junk. "Vance, step away from the railing," Henderson shouted. Elena slowly raised her hands. The magnetron was still warm, the heat seeping through her bandages. She looked at Henderson, her eyes clear and unblinking. "Check the tower, Agent," she said, her voice calm. "Check the Vanguard protocol. The 12-hour window just closed." Henderson stared at her, his weapon still leveled at her chest. For a moment, the only sound was the rain hitting the balcony and the heavy breathing of the marshals. Then, Henderson's radio crackled, a burst of static that eventually resolved into a frantic voice from the command center. Station Queen Anne just reported a localized EM surge, followed by a priority one stand-down handshake from the Pacific grid. "We don't know who sent it, but the Vanguard alert just went from red to green. Someone just stopped the launch sequence." Henderson lowered his weapon. He looked at the smoking remains of the microwave in Elena's hand, then at the woman who had built it. He saw the burns on her arms, the exhaustion in her eyes, and the absolute, terrifying competence that radiated from her like a physical heat. "You're a piece of work, Sergeant," he said, his voice a mix of awe and disbelief. "I'm a technician," Elena replied. "I fix clocks." The aftermath was not a parade. It was a series of closed-door meetings in windowless rooms at the DOJ headquarters in Washington, D.C. 3 weeks later, Elena Vance sat at a long mahogany table, surrounded by men and women in expensive suits who looked at her as if she were a new species they hadn't yet classified. They had decrypted the HAM radio fragments. They had seen the logs from the Navy Annex. They had interviewed Corporal Miller, who had walked into the CID headquarters in Ohio and handed over a challenge coin that contained the key to a conspiracy that reached into the very heart of the Pentagon. The fourth node was officially termed a procedural anomaly in the final report. The public would never know that for 4 hours on a rainy Tuesday night, the Pacific Fleet had been on the verge of an automated war. They would never know that a staff sergeant in a safe house had saved them with a steak knife and a microwave. Holloway was gone, quietly forced into retirement pending a court-martial that would take place behind closed doors. The contractor was in federal custody. The 16 soldiers were finally being given the honors they deserved. Their names read into the congressional record, their families told the truth, or at least, a version of the truth that allowed them to grieve with pride. Elena was offered a promotion to Master Sergeant and a position at the Pentagon's Cyber Command. She was offered a medal she didn't want and a career she no longer believed in. She turned them all down. On a Tuesday morning, exactly 1 month after she had walked off the tarmac at McCord, Elena Vance stood in the office of Colonel Shepard at JBLM. The room was the same as it had been, the same smell of floor wax and old coffee, the same framed photos of paratroopers on the walls. But Shepard looked different. He looked like a man who had realized the institution he served was a clock with a broken mainspring. "You're sure about this, Elena?" Shepard asked, looking at the papers on his desk. "I'm sure, Colonel. You have a rare gift," he said, his voice soft. "The Army needs people who can hear the friction, especially now." "The Army has the signal," Elena said. "They just need to learn how to listen to it. I've done my time on the watch." Shepard nodded slowly. He picked up his pen and signed the voluntary separation agreement. It was the same paper the man in the suit had tried to force her to sign in the hospital, but this time it was on her terms. No NDA, no burials, just a clean break for a woman who had earned the right to be silent. "Where will you go?" he asked. "Home," she said. "Billings. My father has a lot of clocks that need winding." She walked out of the headquarters building, her final out-processing complete. She was carrying a small duffel bag, the same one she'd arrived with. Inside was her challenge coin, a letter from Miller, and the scarred remains of her father's pocket watch, which she had finally managed to fix in the quiet hours at the safe house. As she reached the gate, a familiar figure was waiting for her. Miller was standing by a dusty tan pickup truck, his uniform crisp, his eyes no longer red-rimmed with terror. He looked younger, the weight of the conspiracy having been lifted from his shoulders. He didn't say anything as she approached. He simply opened the passenger door. "I heard you were heading east," Miller said. "I'm heading to Ohio. Figured I could give you a lift as far as the mountains." Elena climbed into the truck, the smell of old upholstery and diesel fuel a welcome change from the antiseptic of the hospital and the cedar of the safe house. She looked at Miller, seeing the boy who had stayed when staying cost him everything. "You okay, Miller?" she asked. "I'm getting there," he said, shifting the truck into gear. "The motor pool isn't so bad. It's quiet. You can hear the engines if you listen close enough." "That's the secret," Elena said, leaning her head back against the seat. "Everything has a rhythm. You just have to find the one that's true." They drove out of the gate and onto the highway, leaving the base behind. They didn't talk about the TOC. They didn't talk about Holloway or the signal or the night on the balcony. They talked about the weather in the Rockies and the best places to get a burger in Idaho. They talked like two people who had survived a storm and were finally learning how to breathe in the sunlight. The sun began to set as they crossed into Montana, the sky turning a deep, bruised purple that reminded Elena of the Pacific after a storm. The mountains rose up to meet them, their peaks capped with the first snow of the season, jagged and white against the darkening horizon. Elena looked out the window, watching the landscape change. She felt the weight of the last month finally beginning to settle, not as a burden, but as a foundation. She was scarred, yes. She was alone in a way she hadn't been before, but she was also free. She had looked into the heart of the machine and found that while it was powerful, it was also fragile. It relied on the silence of people like her to keep its secrets, and she had chosen to speak. The personal cost had been high. She would never again walk into a room and feel like she belonged to the institution. She would never again hear a radio without wondering what was buried in the static. She had lost the comfort of being a soldier, but she had gained the clarity of being herself. They pulled into a small rest stop near Missoula around midnight. The air was crisp and cold, smelling of pine and wet earth. Miller stayed in the truck, catching a few hours of sleep, but Elena stepped out into the night. She walked to the edge of the parking lot, looking out over the valley. The stars were brilliant here, far away from the lights of the city and the interference of the base. They were silent, but as she stood there, Elena Vance realized that they had their own frequency, a slow, ancient pulse that had been beating long before the first clock was ever made. She reached into her pocket and pulled out her father's watch. She clicked open the case, the small, intricate gears catching the starlight. She watched the balance wheel oscillate, back and forth, a perfect, tiny heartbeat in the palm of her hand. She thought about the 16 names. She thought about Sarah. She thought about the signal that was still out there, fragmented and beautiful, held in the hands of 1,000 strangers who had listened when no one else would. The victory was quiet. It was classified. It was a story that would never be told in a history book or honored with a statue. But as Elena stood on the edge of the mountain, listening to the wind whistle through the pines, she knew that the truth didn't need a monument. It just needed someone to remember it. She closed the watch with a soft click and looked toward the east, toward Billings, toward the life she was going to build from the pieces of the one she had broken. The cost had been everything, and she would pay it again tomorrow. The pickup truck's engine cooled with a series of rhythmic, metallic ticks that sounded like a countdown ending in peace. Elena Vance turned and walked back toward the truck, her boots crunching on the gravel, her shadow long and steady in the pale light of the Montana moon. She was no longer a staff sergeant. She was no longer a ghost. She was just a woman who knew the time, and for the first time in a very long time, she wasn't in a hurry to get anywhere. The road ahead was long and dark, but she could hear the music in the silence. The world was out of sync, but she was exactly where she was supposed to be. The last thing she felt before she climbed back into the truck was the steady, unwavering pulse of the earth beneath her feet, a frequency that didn't need a relay or a code to be understood. It was the sound of a world that was still turning, despite everything. She closed her eyes and let the rhythm carry her home. The mountains watched her go, their peaks silent sentinels over a land that had no idea how close it had come to the end, or how much it owed to a woman who would never tell her name. The stars above Montana do not care about the rank of the woman who watches them, only that she is there to see the light.